The November rain hammered against the cracked windows of the abandoned warehouse in South Philadelphia, each drop a percussion note in the symphony of Chris Moretti's downfall. He sat slumped against the cold concrete wall, his expensive Italian suit now torn and stained with blood, some his own, most belonging to the men who'd turned on him just 3 hours earlier. The warehouse smelled of rust, motor oil, and betrayal. Chris pressed his hand against the bullet wound in his shoulder, feeling the warm blood seep between his fingers. At 42 years old, he'd spent 2 decades building his empire from street-level operations to controlling half the city's underground economy. Now, in a single night, everything had collapsed. His second-in-command, Vincent DeMarco, had orchestrated the coup with surgical precision. The family had voted. Chris was out. He checked his phone with trembling hands. Dead. No battery, no lifeline, no way to call the few people who might still be loyal. Even if he could reach them, would they answer? In this business, backing a deposed boss was suicide. Vincent had made sure of that by spreading word that anyone helping Chris would share his fate. The warehouse district was deserted at this hour, nearly midnight. Chris knew he needed medical attention soon, but every hospital would be watched. Vincent's people would be checking emergency rooms across the city, waiting for him to surface. Going to his usual doctor, a man on the family payroll, would be signing his own death warrant. Chris forced himself to stand, his legs shaking from blood loss and shock. He'd lost his empire, his soldiers, his reputation. Everything he'd built over 20 years had been stripped away in a boardroom vote, followed by bullets in the parking garage. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd taken power the same way, removing the previous boss when weakness showed. Now he was the weak one, and the cycle continued. He stumbled toward the warehouse's back exit, each step sending sharp pain through his body. The rain outside had intensified, creating rivers along the cracked asphalt. Chris pulled his jacket tighter, though it did little against the November cold. He needed shelter, needed to think, needed to figure out how a man with no allies and a target on his back could survive the next 24 hours. The streets of South Philadelphia stretched before him, familiar territory, now transformed into a hunting ground. Every shadow could hide one of Vincent's soldiers. Every car that passed might slow down, a window rolling down to reveal a gun barrel. Chris kept to the alleys, moving slowly, conserving what little strength he had left. His mind raced through options, discarding each one as quickly as it formed. His penthouse apartment? Certainly compromised. His mother's house in Jersey? Vincent would have people there within the hour. Safe houses? All known to the organization. Bank accounts? Frozen or emptied by now. Chris Moretti, who'd commanded respect and fear throughout the Philadelphia underworld, was now just another wounded animal trying to survive. The neighborhood around him was working-class Italian and Irish, the kind of area where families had lived for generations. Row houses lined the streets, their facades identical except for small personal touches, a different colored door here, a Virgin Mary statue there. Chris had grown up in a neighborhood like this, before ambition and violence had carried him into a different world. He paused at the corner of 9th and Passyunk, leaning against a brick wall to catch his breath. The pain in his shoulder had evolved from sharp to a dull, throbbing ache that matched his heartbeat. Not a good sign. He needed antibiotics, proper bandaging, rest. Most of all, he needed someone he could trust, but trust was a commodity he'd traded away years ago in favor of fear and respect. A car turned onto the street, its headlights cutting through the rain. Chris pressed himself into the shadows of a doorway, watching as the vehicle passed slowly. Not Vincent's people, just someone heading home from a late shift. Still, his heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline temporarily overriding the weakness spreading through his limbs. When the street cleared, Chris continued moving, though he had no real destination. Survival instinct drove him forward, the primal need to find shelter, to hide, to heal. He'd been in dangerous situations before, shootouts, territorial disputes, close calls with federal investigations. But those times he'd had resources, backup, power. Now he had nothing but the clothes on his back and a body that was shutting down. The commercial strip ahead showed signs of life. A 24-hour laundromat glowed with fluorescent brightness. A corner bodega had its security gate half down, preparing to close. And further down, almost at the end of the block, a pizza shop's neon sign flickered red and white. Tony's Pizza. Since 1987. Chris's stomach twisted with hunger, reminding him he hadn't eaten since the meeting that afternoon, the meeting that had turned into his execution. But food seemed impossible now. He had maybe $60 in his wallet, no credit cards that wouldn't immediately alert Vincent to his location. Every transaction was a risk, every interaction a potential betrayal. He was about to turn down a side street when his legs gave out. Chris collapsed against a parked car, sliding down until he sat on the wet pavement. The rain soaked through his pants, cold and relentless. His vision blurred at the edges, and he recognized the signs of serious blood loss. If he didn't get help soon, Vincent's people wouldn't need to find him. He'd simply bleed out in some forgotten corner of the city he'd once controlled. Through the rain-streaked windows of Tony's Pizza, Chris could see movement inside. Someone was wiping down tables, preparing to close for the night. The warm light looked inviting, almost mocking in its ordinary comfort. That was a world he no longer belonged to, the world of normal people with normal problems, people who didn't live by the gun and die by betrayal. Chris closed his eyes, feeling consciousness start to slip away. Maybe this was better. Maybe dying here, anonymous and forgotten, was preferable to whatever Vincent had planned. At least it would be over quickly. The rain would wash away the blood, and by morning he'd just be another body in a city that produced them regularly. But something in him refused to quit. 20 years of fighting, surviving, climbing over the bodies of rivals and enemies, that instinct for survival ran too deep. Chris opened his eyes and forced himself to focus. The pizza shop. It was warm. It was close. And whoever worked there probably didn't know his face. It wasn't a solution, but it was a chance. Using the car for support, Chris pulled himself upright. His legs threatened to buckle again, but he locked his knees and took a step forward. Then another. The pizza shop was maybe 50 yards away, but it might as well have been 50 miles. Each step required concentration, willpower, and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Halfway there, Chris heard the sound he'd been dreading. A car engine slowing down behind him. He didn't turn, didn't give any indication he'd noticed. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just another resident parking. But the engine idled too long, and Chris's survival instincts screamed danger. He abandoned stealth and moved as quickly as his injured body allowed, reaching the pizza shop's door just as the car door opened behind him. Chris shoved through the entrance, bells jingling overhead, and immediately stumbled toward the counter. The shop was small, maybe 6 tables, walls covered with photos of Italian landmarks and signed headshots of local celebrities. Behind the counter stood a young woman, mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wore a grease-stained apron over jeans and a t-shirt, and her expression shifted from surprise to alarm as Chris collapsed against the counter. "Please," Chris managed, his voice hoarse. "I need—" The shop door opened behind him. Chris didn't need to turn to know who it was. He could feel the predatory presence, the weight of violence entering the small space. His hand instinctively moved toward his waistband, but his gun was gone, taken when they'd beaten him in the garage. "Well, well," a familiar voice said. "Looks like the boss found himself a pizza joint. How the mighty have fallen." Susan Martinez had worked at Tony's Pizza for 3 years, ever since dropping out of Temple University to help support her family. At 26, she'd seen her share of strange customers. Drunks, addicts, people having mental breakdowns at 2 in the morning. But the man who'd just stumbled into the shop was different. The expensive suit, the barely concealed blood, the raw fear in his eyes. This was trouble of a different magnitude. The man who'd followed him through the door was worse. He wore a leather jacket despite the rain, and his hand rested inside it in a way that made Susan's survival instincts flare. She'd grown up in North Philly, in neighborhoods where you learned to read danger or you didn't survive. This man radiated violence like heat from a furnace. "I think you should leave," Susan said, her voice steadier than she felt. Her hand moved under the counter, fingers wrapping around the Louisville Slugger Tony kept for emergencies. "We're closed." The leather jacket man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This doesn't concern you, sweetheart. My friend here and I just need to have a conversation outside." Chris pushed himself upright, swaying but determined. "No conversation needed, Tommy. Vincent sent you to finish the job. Let's not pretend otherwise." Tommy's smile faded. "Vincent wants to talk. You come quiet. Maybe we work something out." "Like you worked something out for Paulie? Or Angelo?" Chris laughed bitterly. "I know how Vincent's conversations end." Susan's mind raced. Whatever this was, mob business, gang violence, drug deal gone wrong, she wanted no part of it. Tony would be furious if she got the shop involved in something that brought police or worse to his door. Her best move was to step back, let these men handle their business. Pretend she'd seen nothing. But the wounded man was leaning against her counter, leaving bloody handprints on the Formica surface Tony had just replaced last month. And despite every logical reason to stay out of it, Susan found herself speaking. "You know what?" she said, addressing Tommy while her grip tightened on the bat. "I already called the cops. Pressed the silent alarm when you walked in looking like you're about to start something. They'll be here in maybe 3 minutes." It was a complete lie. Tony's Pizza didn't have a silent alarm, and Susan's phone was charging in the back room. But Tommy didn't know that, and the momentary uncertainty in his expression told her the bluff had worked. Tommy's hand moved inside his jacket, and Susan pulled the bat into view, resting it on the counter with deliberate casualness. "I also played softball in high school. Made all city. Try pulling whatever you've got in there, and I promise the cops will find you unconscious when they arrive." The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds, though it felt like an hour. Tommy's eyes moved between Susan and Chris, calculating odds, considering consequences. Finally, he took a step back toward the door. "This ain't over, Moretti," Tommy said. "Vincent's patient, but not that patient. You got maybe 24 hours before every soldier in the family is hunting you." "Then I better make them count," Chris replied. Tommy left, the bells jingling cheerfully as the door closed behind him. Through the window, Susan watched him get into a black Escalade that pulled away slowly, deliberately, a promise that this was only a temporary reprieve. She turned back to the wounded man, Moretti, Tommy had called him, and saw he'd slid down to the floor, his back against the counter. Up close she could see the bullet wound in his shoulder, the blood soaking through his shirt, the pale cast to his skin that suggested serious blood loss. "Okay, what the hell did I just get myself into?" Susan asked, moving around the counter to kneel beside him. Chris looked up at her, his eyes focusing with difficulty. "You should have let him take me. Now Vincent will come after you too." "Yeah, well, I've made worse decisions." Susan pulled out her phone, but Chris's hand shot out, surprisingly strong, and grabbed her wrist. "No hospitals, no police. They'll find me, and they'll kill anyone I'm with. You've been shot. You need a doctor." "I need a miracle," Chris said, his voice fading, "but I'll settle for somewhere to hide until I figure out my next move." Susan studied him, her nursing student training from her abbreviated college career kicking in. The wound was serious, but probably not immediately fatal if she could stop the bleeding and prevent infection. She'd done clinical rotations in Temple's emergency department before dropping out. She knew basic trauma care. "Who are you?" she asked. "Nobody," Chris replied. "Not anymore. Tommy called you Moretti, and he mentioned Vincent. I'm not stupid. I've lived in Philly my whole life. I know the families." Susan sat back on her heels. "You're Chris Moretti, the boss who got pushed out last week. It was all over the news, though they called it organizational restructuring." Chris managed a weak smile. "Organizational restructuring with bullets. Very corporate. So why'd they do it?" "Because I got soft. Because I wanted to move the family legitimate. Clean up the operations. Vincent and the old guard didn't like that. They want to keep running drugs, protection rackets, all the bloody business that makes money but brings heat." Chris coughed, wincing at the pain. "I thought I could change things. Turns out the only thing that changed was who's in charge." Susan made a decision that would alter the trajectory of her entire life. She stood up and locked the front door, flipping the open sign to closed. Then she pulled down the security gate's control, sealing the shop from outside view. "Can you walk?" she asked. "Where?" "My apartment. It's 3 blocks from here, above a Vietnamese restaurant. Nobody would think to look there, and I've got medical supplies from when I was studying nursing." Chris stared at her. "Why would you help me? You don't know me. I know you're hurt and those guys want to kill you." "That's enough." Susan paused, then added, "And maybe because my brother got caught up with the wrong people 5 years ago. The family he worked for left him bleeding in an alley when a deal went bad. He died before the ambulance arrived. Maybe I can't save him, but I can save you. Your brother worked for us. For the Castellano family, actually. But you're all the same, right? Using people, throwing them away when they're no longer useful." Susan's voice was sharp, but she extended her hand anyway. "Come on, we don't have much time before your friend comes back with reinforcements." Chris took her hand and let her help him up. Standing required all his remaining strength, and he leaned heavily on Susan as they moved toward the back of the shop. She grabbed her jacket and purse from the office, then guided him through the rear exit into the alley. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, and the November cold cut through Chris's wet clothes. Susan supported most of his weight as they navigated the narrow alley, avoiding overflowing dumpsters and broken pavement. Every step was agony for Chris, but he forced himself to keep moving. They emerged onto a side street, and Susan led him toward a nondescript brick building with faded Vietnamese characters above a darkened restaurant. She helped him up the exterior stairs to the second-floor apartment, fumbling with her keys while supporting his weight. Inside, the apartment was small but clean, a studio with a kitchenette, a bed near the window, and a couch that had seen better days. Posters from art museums covered the walls, and textbooks were stacked on every available surface. Susan guided Chris to the bathroom, the only room with a door, and helped him sit on the closed toilet lid. "Take off your shirt," she said, pulling a first aid kit from under the sink. "I need to see the wound." Chris struggled with his buttons, his fingers clumsy from blood loss. Susan pushed his hands away and unbuttoned the shirt herself, revealing the bullet hole in his shoulder. It was ugly, ragged edges, still bleeding, but the bullet appeared to have passed through cleanly. "You're lucky," Susan said, examining the wound. "Looks like through and through. If it had hit bone or stayed lodged, you'd need surgery." She cleaned the area with antiseptic, causing Chris to hiss in pain. "This is going to hurt worse," she warned, before pouring peroxide directly into the wound. Chris gritted his teeth, gripping the edge of the sink as white foam bubbled from the hole. Susan worked efficiently, her hands steady despite the circumstances. She packed the wound with gauze, then wrapped his shoulder with elastic bandages, making sure to secure everything tightly. "You need antibiotics. I don't have prescription strength, but I've got some amoxicillin left over from a dental procedure. It's better than nothing." "You're good at this," Chris said, watching her work. "I was going to be a nurse. Had 2 semesters left before my mom got sick, and I had to drop out to help with bills." Susan finished the bandaging and stepped back to examine her work. "You should rest. That couch might as well be a bed for tonight." Chris stood slowly, testing his stability. The immediate pain had dulled to a manageable throb, and the bandaging made him feel more secure. "You didn't have to do this. You could have let them take me." "Yeah, well, I've got a thing about watching people die when I can prevent it. Blame the nursing training." Susan handed him a bottle of water and 2 pain pills. "Take these, they're just ibuprofen, but they'll help." Chris swallowed the pills and followed Susan into the main room. She pulled blankets and a pillow from a closet and set up the couch, her movements efficient and practiced. The apartment was warm at least, a stark contrast to the cold rain outside. "Why did you really help me?" Chris asked, as Susan finished arranging the blankets. She turned to face him, arms crossed. "Because Tommy reminded me of the guys who let my brother bleed out. Because I'm tired of men with guns thinking they own the city. Because maybe someone should start saying no to all of you." Susan paused, then added quietly, "And because you looked scared. Really scared. Not like a mob boss, just like a person who didn't want to die." Chris sat heavily on the couch, exhaustion overwhelming him now that the immediate danger had passed. "Vincent will figure out I was at Tony's. He'll check security cameras, ask questions. You're not safe here anymore. Then we'll both figure out what to do in the morning. For now you need sleep, and I need to process that I just harbored a fugitive mob boss in my apartment." Susan grabbed a blanket for herself and settled into the armchair across from the couch. "Try not to die in your sleep. I've got enough trauma without adding that to my resume." Despite everything, the pain, the danger, the complete collapse of his former life, Chris found himself almost smiling. This sharp-tongued pizza delivery girl had saved his life with nothing more than a baseball bat and sheer audacity. In a world of betrayal and calculated violence, her impulsive act of compassion felt almost revolutionary. "Thank you," Chris said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Susan replied. "We're both probably dead by tomorrow." Chris woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment, confusion overwhelmed him. This wasn't his penthouse, wasn't any of his safe houses. Then the events of the previous night crashed back, and he sat up too quickly, sending a spike of pain through his shoulder. "Easy there," Susan said from the kitchenette. She was dressed in fresh clothes, jeans and a Temple University sweatshirt, her hair still damp from a shower. "You've been out for about 7 hours. It's almost 9 in the morning." Chris looked around the apartment in daylight, seeing details he'd missed last night. The textbooks were all medical, anatomy, pharmacology, patient care. Photos on the refrigerator showed Susan with an older woman who shared her features, probably her mother. A small altar in the corner held candles, and a photo of a young man in his early 20s, the brother she'd mentioned. "How's the shoulder?" Susan asked, bringing him coffee in a chipped mug that said, "World's okayest nurse." Better than it should be. Chris accepted the coffee gratefully, the warm liquid helping clear the fog from his mind. "You probably saved my life." "Probably," Susan agreed, sitting on the armchair. "Now we need to figure out what comes next. I called in sick to work, told Tony I had food poisoning. He's annoyed, but he'll deal. More importantly, I've been thinking about your situation. My situation is pretty simple. Vincent wants me dead, I have no resources, and everyone I know either betrayed me or is too scared to help. Not much to think about." Susan leaned forward, her expression serious. "That's where you're wrong. You've got something Vincent doesn't. The truth about where the family's money is, the connections you built, the dirt you must have on everyone. Knowledge is leverage, even when you've lost everything else." Chris studied her with new appreciation. She wasn't just some random good Samaritan. She was smart, strategic, thinking several moves ahead. "You've been planning. Someone has to. You spent most of the night unconscious and bleeding on my couch." Susan pulled out a notepad covered in her handwriting. "Here's what I figure. Vincent pushed you out because you wanted to go legitimate, right? That means there are probably people in the organization who agreed with you, who got overruled or intimidated into going along. Maybe. But they won't stick their necks out for a deposed boss. Not for a deposed boss, no, but what if you weren't deposed? What if you were temporarily, strategically repositioned?" Susan's eyes gleamed with an idea forming. Vincent took power through force and fear. That kind of leadership breeds resentment. If you could show strength, show you're not finished, some of those people might flip back to your side. Chris shook his head. "I appreciate the strategic thinking, but you're missing one key fact. I have no soldiers, no weapons, no money. Vincent controls everything now. Even if some people are unhappy, they're not going to back a losing horse. Then we change the game." Susan stood up and started pacing, her energy infectious. "Vincent expects you to run, to hide, to die quietly. What if you did the opposite? What if you went on offense? With what army? With information? With surprise? With the one thing Vincent can't plan for? Unpredictability from someone he thinks is already beaten." Susan stopped pacing and faced Chris directly. "You said Vincent wants to keep running the dirty businesses. That means he's vulnerable to law enforcement, to federal investigation, to his own illegal activities. You could be the one to expose him." Chris set down his coffee cup. "You're talking about turning informant? Cooperating with the feds? I'm talking about survival. About taking down the person trying to kill you." Susan's voice hardened. "Or is your pride more important than your life?" The question hung in the air between them. Chris had spent 20 years living by a code: never cooperate with law enforcement, never betray the family, maintain omerta at all costs. That code had governed his entire adult life, shaped every decision, defined who he was. But that code had also gotten him shot and left for dead by the very people he'd protected. "It's not about pride," Chris said finally. "It's about what happens after. Even if I cooperate, even if Vincent goes down, the organization doesn't disappear. There are other families, other bosses. The minute I talk to federal agents, I'm marked forever. Witness protection might keep me alive, but it's not really living. And dying in my apartment or in some alley is living?" Susan's frustration showed. "Look, I get it. You have a code, you have history, you have identity wrapped up in being who you were. But that version of Chris Moretti is gone. Vincent made sure of that. The question is, who do you want to be now?" Before Chris could respond, Susan's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's Tony, I should take this," she answered, and Chris watched her expression change from casual to alarmed. "What? When? Are you okay?" A pause. "No, I'm still sick. I can't come in today." "Yeah, I'll call you later." Susan ended the call and turned to Chris, her face pale. "2 men showed up at the pizza shop this morning asking about you. They showed Tony your photo, said you were dangerous, might have been in the area last night. Tony told them he didn't recognize you, but they trashed the place anyway. Broke windows, destroyed equipment, sent a message. Vincent's accelerating," Chris said, standing despite the pain. "He's making a show of it, demonstrating power. Anyone who helps me becomes a target. Tony didn't give you up, though. Even when they destroyed his shop, he said he didn't recognize you." Susan looked troubled. That's going to cost him. Insurance doesn't cover mob intimidation. Chris felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders, the weight of being responsible for other people's suffering. It was why he'd wanted to take the family legitimate in the first place, to stop the endless cycle of violence and collateral damage. But Vincent and the traditionalists had rejected that vision, and now innocent people like Tony were paying the price. "I need to leave," Chris said. "Every minute I stay here puts you in more danger." "Leave and go where? You said yourself you have nowhere to go." "I'll figure something out, I always do." Susan grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Or we could try my idea. Contact the FBI, offer to cooperate in exchange for protection, and help taking down Vincent. You've got to have information they want. Names, operations, financial records." "I do," Chris admitted. "I know where half the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively. But Susan, you don't understand what you're asking. The moment I make that call, I cross a line I can never uncross. Everyone I've ever known, every connection I've ever had, it all becomes worthless. I become the worst thing a person in my world can be. A survivor?" The simplicity of her response stopped him. Chris had been thinking about betrayal, about codes and consequences. Susan was thinking about staying alive. The difference in perspective was stark. She hadn't been corrupted by decades in the underworld, hadn't internalized the rules that seemed more important than life itself. "You're right that I'm scared," Chris said quietly, "but not just of Vincent. I'm scared of becoming the kind of person who saves himself by destroying everyone else. That's the road to a different kind of death." Susan sat back down, her energy deflating. "Then what do you want to do? Because hiding here isn't a long-term solution, and I can't protect you forever with a baseball bat and good intentions." Chris sat beside her on the couch, close enough that he could see the worry in her eyes. "Why are you doing this, really? You said it was about your brother, about saying no to men with guns. But that doesn't explain why you'd risk everything for someone you just met, someone from the world that got your brother killed." Susan was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. "My brother, Miguel, he was a good kid, smart, funny, wanted to be a teacher, but our neighborhood, our circumstances, they pulled him into the life. He thought he could make quick money, help the family, then get out. But nobody gets out, do they?" "No," Chris said. "They usually don't. When he died, the family he worked for sent flowers to the funeral. Expensive flowers like that made up for leaving him to bleed out alone. My mother was grateful. Can you believe that? Grateful for flowers from the people who got him killed." Susan's voice broke slightly. "I swore then that I'd never be grateful to men like that, never accept their violence as just how things are. So I'm your chance to fight back? Maybe. Or maybe you're just someone who needs help and I'm someone who can give it. Does it matter why?" Susan looked at him directly. "You're here, you're hurt, and you have a choice to make. I can't make it for you, but I can tell you this. Dying because you're too proud to break your code isn't heroic, it's just stupid." Chris laughed despite himself. "You don't pull punches, do you? Life's too short for that." Susan stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street below. "There's a car that's been circling the block for the past 20 minutes. Black sedan, tinted windows. That normal for this neighborhood." Chris joined her at the window, moving carefully to stay out of sight. He recognized the car immediately, one of Vincent's surveillance vehicles. They'd found him, or at least narrowed down the search area. It was only a matter of time before they started checking apartments. "We need to move," Chris said. "Now." "Where?" Chris thought fast, running through options. His old life was closed to him, but there were still a few people who owed him favors, people who existed outside the organization's direct control. "There's a woman, Diane Russo. She runs a legal business, imports, exports. I helped her husband avoid a problem with the unions 10 years ago. She might be willing to hide us for a day or two." "Us?" Susan raised an eyebrow. "You're involved now, whether you want to be or not. That car down there, they're not looking for me anymore. They're looking for whoever helped me, and once they figure out it was someone from Tony's Pizza, they'll connect it to you pretty quickly." Chris met her eyes. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to drag you into this." Susan grabbed her jacket and purse. "Then let's not waste time apologizing. Call this Diane person, and let's get moving." Chris used Susan's phone to dial a number he'd memorized years ago, but never thought he'd need. It rang 4 times before a cautious voice answered. "Diane, it's Chris Moretti. I need a favor, and I need it right now." The pause on the other end stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Diane's voice came through, tight with worry. "Chris, Everyone's looking for you. Vincent put out word that helping you is a death sentence. I know, but you owe me, Diane. Your husband would be in prison, or dead, if I hadn't intervened. I'm calling in that debt. Another pause. Where are you? Chris gave her the address, keeping his voice low. There's surveillance outside. We need extraction and a safe place to stay. This is dangerous, Chris. I know, but I'm out of options, and I've got an innocent woman with me who helped me and is now a target too. Diane sighed. Give me 30 minutes. There's a Vietnamese restaurant on the ground floor, right? Go through the kitchen, out the back delivery door. There's an alley that connects to the next street over. I'll have a car waiting. Grey Honda Accord. Driver's name is Marcus. He's clean, not connected to any of this. Thank you, Diane. Don't thank me. Just survive this, because if you get caught, I can't help you again. The line went dead. Chris relayed the plan to Susan, who'd been gathering essentials, phone charger, some cash, a change of clothes stuffed into a backpack. She moved with surprising calm given the circumstances, her earlier nursing training perhaps making her accustomed to emergency situations. Ready? Chris asked. As ready as I'll ever be for running from the mob. Susan shouldered her backpack. Let's go before I overthink this and realize how completely insane this is. They left the apartment quietly, taking the interior stairs down to avoid the front entrance. The Vietnamese restaurant was closed. It didn't open until 11, but Susan had befriended the owner's daughter months ago. She knocked on the back door with a specific pattern, and after a moment, a young woman opened it. Susan, what's wrong? Long story, Mai. I need to cut through your kitchen to the back alley. Just for a minute. Then I'll be gone. Mai looked between Susan and Chris, taking in the expensive but ruined suit, the bandaged shoulder visible through the torn shirt, the desperation in both their faces. You in trouble? Yes, but it'll be worse if I stay. Mai hesitated only a moment before stepping aside. Go quick, my dad will be here soon to start prep. Susan hugged her briefly. Thank you. I'll explain everything when this is over, I promise. They moved through the industrial kitchen, past gleaming steel counters and the smell of star anise and fish sauce. The back door led to a narrow alley lined with dumpsters and delivery pallets. The November morning was cold but clear, the previous night's rain having washed the streets clean. Chris and Susan emerged onto a side street, and true to Diane's word, a grey Honda Accord sat idling at the corner. A middle-aged black man with kind eyes sat behind the wheel. He didn't speak, just nodded as they climbed into the back seat. Marcus drove carefully, obeying all traffic laws, taking a winding route through South Philadelphia that avoided major streets. Chris kept watching through the rear window, looking for tails, but Marcus seemed to know what he was doing. After 20 minutes of driving, they pulled into an underground parking garage in the Northern Liberties neighborhood. Elevator to the 3rd floor, Marcus said, his first words, apartment 3F. Mrs. Russo is waiting. They exited the car and took the elevator up in silence. The building was upscale, converted warehouse lofts with exposed brick and high ceilings. Apartment 3F's door opened before they could knock, revealing a woman in her late 50s with perfectly styled silver hair and sharp eyes. Inside quickly, Diane Russo said, ushering them into a spacious loft. We don't have much time. The apartment was elegantly furnished, art on the walls, but it had the impersonal feeling of a place that wasn't someone's primary residence. Diane closed the door and engaged 3 separate locks. This is one of my company's corporate apartments, she explained. Not registered to me personally. No connection to your old organization. You should be safe here for a few days, but that's all I can give you. A few days is more than I had this morning, Chris said. Thank you, Diane. Diane turned her attention to Susan. And you are? Susan Martinez, the idiot who decided to help him. Susan extended her hand, which Diane shook with an appraising look. Takes courage to help someone Vincent DeMarco wants dead. Courage or foolishness, I'm not sure which. Diane moved to the kitchen and started making coffee, her movements automatic. Chris, I need to know, what's your end game here? You can't hide forever, and you can't fight Vincent without resources. I'm working on that, Chris said, accepting a cup of coffee. Work faster. Vincent's making moves, consolidating power. He's meeting with the other families tonight, getting their blessing for his leadership. Once that happens, you're not just fighting your former organization. You're fighting the entire Philadelphia underworld. Diane sat down across from them. You need leverage, something that makes you more valuable alive than dead. Susan spoke up. He could cooperate with federal authorities, trade information for protection. Diane's expression hardened. That's a death sentence, not just for Chris, but for anyone associated with him. The feds can't protect him forever, and the minute he surfaces, there'll be a contract on his head that no amount of witness protection can prevent. So, what's your suggestion? Susan challenged. Find something Vincent wants more than revenge, something that forces him to negotiate. Diane looked at Chris. You ran the organization for 5 years. You must have contingency plans, hidden assets, insurance policies against exactly this kind of situation. Chris had been avoiding thinking about his contingency plans, because using them would mean burning every bridge, destroying relationships built over decades. But Diane was right. They were his only leverage. I have files, Chris admitted. Financial records, documentation of illegal operations, connections to corrupt officials. Everything I've accumulated as insurance against internal threats. Where are these files? Safe deposit box under a false name. But accessing it is risky. Banks have cameras and Vincent's people are probably watching financial institutions. Diane thought for a moment. I might be able to help with that. My company has banking relationships. We move money through legitimate channels all the time. If I can get power of attorney, I could access the box on your behalf. That puts you directly in the line of fire, Chris said. I'm already there. The moment I picked up your call, I chose a side. Diane's voice was firm. My husband died 3 years ago. He never forgot that you saved his life when the union dispute went violent. This is me honoring that debt. Susan watched this exchange with interest, seeing a side of the criminal world she'd never understood. The genuine loyalty, the debts that transcended business. It wasn't the violent chaos she'd witnessed with her brother, but something more complex, more human. If you can get those files, Chris said, I can use them to force Vincent to the table, threaten to turn them over to federal prosecutors unless he backs off. That's basically blackmail, Susan pointed out. It's survival, Diane corrected, and it might be the only way Chris lives through this. Outside, the afternoon sun struggled through November clouds, casting grey light through the loft's floor-to-ceiling windows. Chris looked out over the Philadelphia skyline, a city he'd once thought he controlled, now turned against him. Somewhere out there, Vincent was consolidating power, turning Chris's former allies into enemies, rewriting history to make himself the hero and Chris the villain. But Chris wasn't dead yet, and as long as he was alive, there was still a chance to turn this around. The plan came together over the next 2 hours, huddled around Diane's kitchen table with coffee growing cold in their cups. Diane made calls, pulled strings, used her legitimate business connections to create a cover story that would allow her to access Chris's safe deposit box without raising alarms. The bank opens at 9 tomorrow morning, Diane said, hanging up from her third call. I've established you as a business partner, filed emergency power of attorney paperwork citing your medical incapacity. It's thin, but it should hold up to cursory scrutiny. What about surveillance? Susan asked. She'd been quiet for most of the planning session, absorbing the details of a world she'd only known from the outside. That's the tricky part, Diane admitted. Vincent's people can't watch every bank in the city, but they're definitely monitoring the major ones. The question is whether they know about Chris's safety deposit box. Chris shook his head. I set it up years ago under a shell corporation, 3 layers of separation from my name. Only 2 people knew about it, me and my accountant, Frank Delgado. Can Frank be trusted? Diane asked. He's been dead for 6 months. Heart attack. Chris's expression darkened. Or at least that's what the coroner said. Now I'm wondering if Vincent had him killed to clean up loose ends. If Vincent knew about the box, he would have emptied it already, Susan reasoned. The fact that you're still worried about it means it's probably secure. Probably isn't certainty, Diane said, but it's what we have to work with. The rest of the evening passed in tense preparation. Diane provided Chris with fresh clothes, expensive business attire that had belonged to her late husband. They were slightly too large, but Chris made them work. Susan helped him change the bandages on his shoulder, pleased to see the wound was healing cleanly, despite the lack of proper medical care. You're lucky you heal fast, Susan said, applying fresh gauze. Most people would have serious infection by now. I've been shot before, Chris said quietly. Occupational hazard. That's a hell of an occupation. They ate dinner from takeout containers, Thai food that Diane had delivered, and tried to ignore the elephant in the room. Even if they successfully retrieved the files, they'd only bought themselves temporary safety. Vincent wouldn't stop hunting Chris, and by extension, wouldn't stop hunting Susan and Diane. That night, Susan took the guest bedroom, while Chris insisted on sleeping on the couch despite Diane's protests. He couldn't shake the feeling that bringing these women into his problems was a betrayal of everything he'd once stood for. The old Chris Moretti would have never involved civilians, would have handled his problems through proper channels, meaning violence and intimidation. But the old Chris Moretti was dead, killed in that parking garage when his own soldiers had turned on him. This new version, wounded and desperate, was learning that survival sometimes meant accepting help from unexpected sources. Around 2 in the morning, Chris heard movement in the apartment. He tensed, hand reaching instinctively for a weapon that wasn't there, before recognizing Susan's silhouette moving toward the kitchen. "Can't sleep?" Chris asked quietly. Susan jumped, then relaxed when she saw him. "Too much adrenaline. Too many thoughts about how my life went from delivering pizzas to harboring fugitive mob bosses in the span of 24 hours. Chris sat up as Susan poured herself water from the kitchen tap. She moved to the living room and settled into the armchair across from him, her face pale in the dim light filtering through the windows. "You could still walk away," Chris said. "Diane can get you somewhere safe, set you up with money to start over. And what? Spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering if someone connected me to you?" Susan shook her head. "I'm already in this. Might as well see it through." "You're remarkably calm for someone whose life just imploded." Susan laughed quietly. "Calm is relative. Inside, I'm terrified, but I learned a long time ago that falling apart doesn't solve problems. My mum got sick when I was 23, and I had to become the stable one, the person who handled things. You develop a mask, appearing calm even when everything's chaos. What was she sick with? Cancer, ovarian. We caught it too late." Susan's voice carried old pain. "That's why I was studying nursing. I wanted to help people the way I couldn't help her. Turns out life had different plans. I'm sorry about your mother and your brother." "Yeah, well, sorry doesn't change anything." Susan met his eyes. "But maybe helping you does. Maybe this is my chance to actually make a difference, to stop men like Vincent from destroying more lives. You realize that's a massive burden to take on. Vincent is one boss in one family in one city. The system that created him goes on forever." "Every revolution starts somewhere," Susan said with a slight smile. "Maybe ours starts with retrieving some files from a bank." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two people from completely different worlds finding unexpected common ground. Chris recognized something in Susan that he'd lost years ago. Genuine idealism, the belief that individual actions could matter. He'd traded that for pragmatism and power, and look where it had gotten him. "Tomorrow's going to be dangerous," Chris said finally. "Even with Diane's cover story, there's risk. If something goes wrong, then we deal with it," Susan interrupted. "Stop trying to plan for every disaster. Sometimes you have to take the leap and figure it out as you fall." That's terrible advice. And yet here we are, still alive despite all odds. Susan stood and stretched. "Get some sleep, Chris. Tomorrow we take the first step toward getting your life back." After Susan returned to the guest room, Chris lay awake thinking about her words. Getting his life back, but what life? His old existence was irretrievable, burned to ash by Vincent's betrayal. Even if they succeeded, even if they somehow neutralized Vincent's threat, Chris could never return to being the man he was. Maybe that wasn't entirely bad. The old Chris had built an empire on fear and violence, had participated in activities that destroyed families and corrupted communities. He'd justified it all as business, as necessary as just how things were done, but lying here in a borrowed apartment, dependent on the kindness of women he'd barely met, Chris had to confront an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps he'd deserved to fall. The question was whether he deserved a second chance. Morning arrived grey and cold, November asserting itself with the kind of damp chill that seeped into bones. Diane was already dressed in business attire, projecting corporate confidence. She'd prepared a cover story in detail. Chris was a business associate who'd been in a car accident, incapacitated but needing urgent access to partnership documents stored in the safety deposit box. "Susan should stay here," Diane said over breakfast. "No need to expose all of us." "No," Susan said firmly. "I go where Chris goes. You said it yourself, we're all targets now. Might as well stay together." Diane looked like she wanted to argue but recognized the futility. "Fine. But you follow my lead at the bank. No improvisation, no heroics. We get in, get the files, get out." The bank was in Center City, a massive stone building that had served Philadelphia's financial elite for over a century. Diane's driver, a different person than Marcus, a young woman with alert eyes, dropped them off 2 blocks away. They walked the remaining distance, Diane in front, projecting authority, Chris and Susan following as her associates. The morning was busy, people rushing to work, homeless individuals huddled in doorways against the cold. Philadelphia went on with its daily rhythms, completely oblivious to the small drama of survival playing out among them. Inside the bank, classical music played softly over speakers, and the marble floors gleamed under chandeliers. Diane approached a customer service representative with perfect professional poise. "I need to access a corporate safety deposit box. I've been granted temporary power of attorney due to my partner's medical emergency." She produced expertly forged documents, each page looking official and legitimate. The representative, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a chain, examined the papers carefully. Chris held his breath, expecting challenge, exposure, the arrival of security. But after what felt like an eternity, the woman nodded. "Everything appears in order. I'll need identification and signature verification." Diane provided her driver's license and signed the required forms with practiced ease. Chris marveled at how seamlessly she navigated this world of legitimate business. It was its own kind of criminal expertise, just legal. They were led to a private room where the representative retrieved the safety deposit box, a long metal container that Chris hadn't seen in 3 years. She left them alone with instructions to take their time, and the door clicked shut with finality. Chris opened the box with shaking hands. Inside were USB drives, folders of documents, and a small handgun with ammunition, his emergency cache against disaster. He pulled out the USB drives first, 5 of them, each labeled with innocuous-sounding names but containing years of damning evidence. "This is everything?" Diane asked. "Everything I need to destroy Vincent and half the organization." Chris sorted through the folders, refreshing his memory on what he'd documented. Financial records showing money laundering through legitimate businesses. Communications linking Vincent to 3 unsolved murders. Payoff schedules for judges and police officials. Video evidence of illegal activities. Susan whistled low. "You could take down the entire family with this." "That's the idea. Mutually assured destruction. Vincent doesn't move against me because I can expose everything." Chris pocketed the USB drives and the gun. "The question is whether he'll believe I'm actually willing to do it." "You're not actually willing to do it, are you?" Susan asked. Chris met her eyes. "I honestly don't know. Using this information means destroying people who trusted me, who believed in the organization. It means confirming every negative stereotype about mob informants. It also means staying alive," Diane pointed out, "and possibly saving Susan's life too. Don't forget she's at risk because of you." The weight of that responsibility settled on Chris like a physical burden. Susan had helped him out of compassion, out of a desire to make a difference, and he'd repaid her by painting a target on her back. The least he could do was ensure she survived his war with Vincent. They left the bank without incident, though Chris felt watched the entire way out. Paranoia or instinct? With Vincent's resources, either was possible. Diane's driver picked them up at the designated corner, and they began the careful drive back to the loft. Halfway there, Susan's phone rang. She answered it, then her expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "Mai, slow down. What happened?" Chris watched Susan's face drain of color as she listened. After a moment, she ended the call with trembling hands. "They went to the restaurant, Vincent's people. They questioned Mai about us, about seeing us yesterday morning. When she said she didn't know anything, Susan's voice broke. "They beat her father, put him in the hospital, told her if she sees us again, they'll come back and finish the job." Diane cursed under her breath. "Vincent's casting a wide net. He's not just looking for you anymore. He's making examples of anyone who might have helped. Tony's shop, now the restaurant," Susan said, anger replacing fear. "How many innocent people have to suffer because of this?" Chris felt rage building in his chest, not the cold, calculated anger he'd used to manage his organization, but something hotter, more personal. Vincent wasn't just trying to kill him. He was terrorizing a neighborhood, hurting people who had nothing to do with their conflict. This was about demonstrating power, showing the city that crossing Vincent DeMarco meant destruction for everyone around you. "This changes things," Chris said quietly. "I was planning to use the files as leverage for negotiation." Now I'm thinking maybe Vincent doesn't deserve negotiation. What are you saying? Diane asked. I'm saying maybe it's time to stop playing defense and start playing offense. Chris pulled out one of the USB drives. These files contain enough evidence to put Vincent and his top people away for life. What if we didn't just threaten to release them? What if we actually did it? That's suicide, Diane said flatly. The moment that information goes public, you become the biggest target in the criminal underworld. Every family in every city will want you dead as an example. Maybe, but Vincent would be in federal custody, unable to give orders, and the disruption to the organization would create chaos, maybe enough chaos for me to disappear properly. Chris looked at Susan. I'm tired of innocent people getting hurt because I'm too afraid to do what's necessary. Susan studied him carefully. You're sure about this? Once you cross that line, there's no going back. You'll be exactly what every mob movie says is the worst thing, a rat. I'd rather be a living rat than a dead boss, Chris said. And more importantly, I'd rather Mai's father didn't get beaten, Tony's shop didn't get destroyed, and you didn't spend the rest of your life running. The only way to end this is to end Vincent. Diane pulled the car into a parking garage 3 blocks from the loft, a security measure, avoiding direct connections. As they walked the remaining distance, Chris's mind raced through logistics. He needed to contact the FBI, needed to negotiate terms, needed to ensure protection for Susan and Diane as witnesses or associates. Most critically, he needed to do all of this before Vincent figured out where they were hiding. Back at the loft, Chris laid out the USB drives on the kitchen table like playing cards. 5 drives, each containing years of evidence. Together, they represented the complete dismantling of an organization that had existed in some form for nearly 80 years. Before we do this, Susan said, I need to know something. Are you doing this because it's right or because you're angry? Chris considered the question honestly. Both. I'm furious at Vincent for what he's doing to innocent people. But I also recognize that the organization I built, the world I participated in, it was always doing this. We just targeted different people, justified it differently. Maybe this is my chance to actually stop it, not just redirect it. That's a very convenient moral awakening, Diane observed dryly. Right when your life is on the line. Convenient doesn't make it wrong, Chris countered. People change. Circumstances force evolution. I'm not going to pretend I'm suddenly a saint, but I can choose to be less of a sinner going forward. Susan pulled out her phone. So how do we contact the FBI without tipping off Vincent's people on their payroll? Because you said yourself there are corrupt officials. We go to the media first, Chris said. Give copies of the files to investigative journalists at major papers, Philadelphia Inquirer, New York Times, Washington Post. Once it's published, the FBI has no choice but to act. They can't bury it or delay because of compromised agents. Diane nodded slowly. That's actually smart. Journalists love taking down corrupt officials and organized crime. The story's big enough to go national, maybe international. But it puts a timer on everything, Susan pointed out. Once those files are out there, Vincent knows you betrayed him. He'll come after us with everything he has, which is why we need to be somewhere he can't reach when the story breaks. Somewhere far away with new identities and protection. Chris looked at Diane. Can you arrange that? Discreet travel, cash payments, no electronic trail? I can try. But it'll take time, at least 48 hours to set up properly. Diane pulled out her phone. I have contacts who specialize in making people disappear. Legitimate reasons, usually. Witnesses in civil cases, abuse victims fleeing dangerous partners. They can help us too. 48 hours means we need to hold Vincent off until then. Susan started pacing, her mind working. We need a safe house, somewhere completely disconnected from everyone's history. Not your properties. Not Chris's old holdings, not anywhere Vincent could anticipate. I might have something, Diane said. A friend's cabin in the Poconos. She's in Europe for 2 months, left me with keys to check on it. It's remote, off the grid in terms of electronic surveillance. We could disappear there while the arrangements get finalized. Chris felt the pieces of a plan coming together. It was risky, dependent on too many variables going right, but it was better than passive hiding. Okay, here's what we do. Tonight, we contact journalists, send encrypted copies of the files to at least 5 major media outlets. Tomorrow morning, assuming they verify and start preparing stories, we leave for the cabin. By the time the articles publish, probably in 2 or 3 days, we're already executing our exit strategy. "And if Vincent finds us before then?" Susan asked. Chris picked up the handgun from the safety deposit box, checked the magazine, chambered around with practiced ease. "Then I remember I wasn't always a boss. I started as a soldier, and soldiers know how to fight." The determination in his voice seemed to convince them. Diane made calls to her disappearance specialists, negotiating prices and timelines. Susan researched investigative journalists known for mob coverage, compiling contact information. Chris began the tedious process of organizing the files, creating packages that told coherent stories. Financial crimes here, violence there, corruption in a third folder. As afternoon faded into evening, the loft became a nerve center of controlled chaos. Pizza boxes accumulated, ordered carefully through third-party delivery services to avoid tracking. Coffee pots were drained and refilled, and the weight of what they were about to do settled on everyone involved. Around 10 p.m. they were ready. Chris had written a brief statement explaining his identity, his position in the organization, and his motivation for coming forward. It was honest without being maudlin, acknowledging his complicity while explaining his breaking point. "Last chance to back out," Chris said, his finger hovering over the send button that would transmit encrypted files to journalists across the country. "Once I do this, we're committed." Susan sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Send it. No more innocent people get hurt because we were too afraid to act." Diane nodded her agreement from across the room. "Send it. I didn't help you this far to watch you chicken out at the critical moment." Chris hit send. The files began transmitting, megabytes of evidence flowing through encrypted channels to reporters who would spend the next day verifying, fact-checking, preparing the stories that would change everything. There was no taking it back now, no changing course. They'd set events in motion that would either save them or destroy them. "Now we wait," Diane said. "Journalists will need time to verify everything, get legal clearance to publish, contact the FBI for comment. We have maybe 36 hours before this goes public." "Then we better make them count," Susan said. She looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep and stress, but her voice remained steady. "When do we leave for the cabin?" "First light tomorrow," Diane answered. "I'll have supplies delivered there tonight, food, medical supplies, burner phones, everything we need to stay hidden for a week if necessary." Chris stood and walked to the window, looking out over Philadelphia's nighttime skyline. Somewhere out there, Vincent was consolidating power, unaware that his empire was about to collapse. Somewhere, Mai was visiting her father in the hospital, dealing with trauma she never deserved. Somewhere, Tony was surveying the ruins of his pizza shop, wondering why being a decent person had cost him so much. "I'm going to make this right," Chris said quietly. "Whatever it takes, whatever I have to sacrifice, Vincent's going to pay for every person he's hurt." Susan joined him at the window. "Revenge isn't the same as justice." "No, but sometimes they overlap." Chris turned to face her. "You asked me earlier why I'm doing this. The honest answer is that I'm doing it because you shamed me into remembering what having principles feels like. You and Diane both. You're risking everything without the baggage I carry, without the benefits I had. If you can be that brave, then I can at least try to be worthy of it." "That's the most honest thing you've said since we met," Susan observed with a slight smile. They spent the night in shifts, 2 people sleeping while one kept watch, just in case Vincent's people somehow tracked them. Chris took the first watch, sitting with the gun on the coffee table and his thoughts for company. He found himself thinking about paths not taken, decisions that had seemed inevitable at the time, but now looked like choices. He could have refused the promotion that started his rise in the organization, could have gone legitimate 20 years ago when he'd had the chance, could have walked away from the violence instead of embracing it as necessary. Each decision had seemed logical in context, but strung together they formed a chain leading directly to this moment. Exiled, hunted, dependent on strangers. Around 3 a.m. Susan relieved him. Chris tried to sleep, but found his mind too active, too aware of how precarious their situation remained. Tomorrow they'd drive to the Poconos, hide in a cabin, and wait for journalists to publish stories that would destroy the organization he'd spent 2 decades building. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd wanted to take the family legitimate, and now he'd accomplish it by tearing the whole structure down. Morning arrived cold and bright, November sun breaking through the previous day's clouds. Diane had arranged for a nondescript SUV, several years old, registered to one of her shell companies. They loaded minimal supplies, clothes, the remaining cash, the handgun, copies of the files on USB drives as insurance. "Once we leave, there's no coming back to this apartment," Diane warned. "Vincent's people will find it eventually, and anything left behind becomes evidence or leverage." They took one last look around the loft that had sheltered them, then left. The building's parking garage felt exposed, every shadow a potential threat, but they reached the SUV without incident. Diane drove, Chris in the passenger seat with the gun tucked into his jacket, Susan in the back monitoring their surroundings. The drive to the Poconos took 2 hours through increasingly rural Pennsylvania landscape. November had stripped the trees bare, leaving skeletal branches against grey sky. They passed through small towns that seemed frozen in time, places where organized crime was an abstraction from movies rather than lived reality. The cabin sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by woods and isolated from neighbors. It was modest. 2 bedrooms, a living area with a fireplace, a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 1980s, but it was safe. More importantly, it was anonymous, a place with no connection to any of them. They spent the day settling in, checking the perimeter, ensuring they had cell reception despite the remote location. Diane's contacts had delivered supplies as promised. Enough food for a week, medical equipment, 3 burner phones with prepaid minutes. Everything they needed to wait out the storm. That night, as they sat around the fireplace eating canned soup and bread, the tension finally broke. Susan laughed at something Diane said, and suddenly they were all laughing, the kind of desperate, relieved laughter that comes from surviving when death seems certain. "We're actually doing this," Susan said, wiping tears from her eyes. "We're actually taking down a mob boss with USB drives and journalism." "It's very 21st century, Diane agreed. "No bullets, just data." Chris smiled, but his expression was troubled. "Don't celebrate yet. The files being published is just the beginning. Then comes the federal investigation, the trial, witness protection negotiations. And through all of it, Vincent will be trying to kill us. So we stay ahead of him," Susan said with more confidence than she felt. "We're smart, we're motivated, and we have right on our side." "Right doesn't stop bullets," Chris observed. "No, but it helps you sleep at night." Susan stood and stretched. "I'm going to bed. Wake me if the world ends." After Susan retreated to one of the bedrooms, Diane and Chris sat in comfortable silence, watching flames dance in the fireplace. Finally, Diane spoke. "My husband used to say you were the only honorable man in a dishonorable business. He respected you for trying to change things from inside." Diane's voice was soft with memory. "I think he'd be proud of what you're doing now, even if it means destroying everything you built." "I hope so," Chris said, "because I'm terrified I'm making the biggest mistake of my life." "Mistakes are learning opportunities. What matters is what you do after." Diane stood and patted his shoulder. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we find out if journalists believed our evidence, and then the real game begins." Chris took first watch again, gun on his lap, staring into the fire. Outside, the Pennsylvania woods were silent, except for wind through bare branches, and the occasional call of nightbirds. It was peaceful in a way Chris hadn't experienced in years. No city noise, no constant awareness of threats, just the simplicity of survival. He thought about Susan's words, that revenge wasn't the same as justice. She was right, of course, but Chris recognized his motivation was more complex than either concept. He was doing this because continuing the old ways had become impossible, because Vincent's betrayal had broken whatever internal justification Chris had used to rationalize the violence, because 2 women who owed him nothing had shown him what real courage looked like. Tomorrow would bring answers. Journalists would either run the stories or decide the risk was too great. The FBI would either launch investigations or try to bury the evidence. Vincent would either be arrested or would escalate his hunt. Every outcome led to more uncertainty, more danger, more difficult choices. But for tonight, in a cabin in the Pennsylvania woods, with 2 unlikely allies sleeping nearby, Chris Moretti allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not for returning to his old life, not for power or respect or any of the things that had once defined him. Just hope that maybe, possibly, he could do something genuinely good before this all ended. The fire burned low, and Chris fed it another log, watching sparks rise toward the chimney. Outside, dawn was still hours away. Plenty of time for things to go wrong. Plenty of time for Vincent to find them, for the plan to collapse, for everything to fall apart. But also plenty of time for the world to change, for justice to find its moment. For three people who shouldn't have survived this long to beat the odds one more time. The morning of the second day at the cabin, Chris's burner phone rang at exactly 6:47 a.m. He'd been awake for an hour, watching sunrise paint the Pennsylvania woods in shades of gold and amber, nursing terrible instant coffee and wondering if journalists had found his evidence credible or insane. The number was unfamiliar, but Chris had given this specific phone number to only 5 people, the investigative journalists he'd contacted. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Moretti," a woman's voice, professional but excited. "This is Jennifer Carlisle from the Philadelphia Inquirer. We've verified your files, confirmed the financial records with independent sources, and cross-referenced the evidence with multiple ongoing federal investigations. We're publishing the story in today's paper, going live on our website at noon. The FBI has already contacted us for comment." Chris felt his heart rate accelerate. "You're certain about the evidence? No legal concerns? Our lawyers have been working overtime, but everything checks out. The corruption, the money laundering, the connections to unsolved crimes, it's all solid. This is the biggest organized crime story to hit Philadelphia in decades." Jennifer paused. "We'll protect your identity as our source as long as legally possible, but you should know, Vincent DeMarco's attorney has already issued threats of litigation. They know this is coming." "How long until the FBI moves?" Chris asked. "They've been non-committal in official statements, but off the record our sources say arrest warrants are being prepared, probably by end of business today." Jennifer's voice softened slightly. "Mr. Moretti, what you're doing, it's dangerous, but important. We'll tell this story responsibly, but you need to protect yourself. These people don't forgive whistleblowers." "I know," Chris said quietly. "Thank you for believing the evidence. Thank you for providing it. Stay safe." The line went dead. Chris sat motionless for a moment, processing the information. Noon. In less than 6 hours, the story would break, the evidence would be public, and Vincent would know definitively that Chris had crossed the ultimate line. There would be no negotiation after that, no chance of reconciliation, just a race between federal protection and mob vengeance. Susan emerged from her bedroom, hair disheveled from sleep, drawn by the sound of Chris's voice. Was that the journalists? "They're publishing today. Noon." Chris stood and began pacing. "The FBI is preparing arrest warrants. Everything moves fast from here." Diane joined them from the other bedroom, already dressed despite the early hour. "Then we need to accelerate our exit strategy. My contact said the new identities would be ready in 24 hours, but we might not have that long. Once Vincent knows for certain you talked, he'll mobilize every resource." "Can we move any faster?" Susan asked. "I'll make calls." Diane pulled out her own burner phone and stepped outside onto the cabin's porch, her voice immediately dropping into urgent negotiation. Chris and Susan were left alone in the cabin's small living room, morning light streaming through dusty windows. The reality of what they'd set in motion settled between them like a physical presence. "Are you scared?" Susan asked. "Terrified," Chris admitted. "Not of dying, I've been close to that before, but of what happens after. Witness protection means abandoning everything, everyone, every connection to my old life. It means becoming someone completely different. Maybe that's not a bad thing. The old Chris Moretti built an empire on violence. Maybe the new version builds something better. Very optimistic for someone whose life I've completely upended." Susan moved to the kitchen and started making breakfast. Scrambled eggs with provisions from Diane's supplies, toast from bread that was slightly stale but acceptable. "My life was already upended. I dropped out of college, worked a dead-end job delivering pizzas, lived in a tiny apartment. This," she gestured around the cabin, "is terrifying, but at least it's different. At least it feels like I'm doing something that matters." Chris helped her cook, finding unexpected comfort in the domestic normalcy of cracking eggs and buttering toast. "You sound like you're trying to convince yourself." "Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm trying to convince you that we didn't make a terrible mistake." Susan plated the eggs and brought them to the small dining table. "Eat. Whatever happens today, we'll need our strength." They ate in silence, each lost in thoughts about an uncertain future. Diane returned from the porch, her expression tense. "My contact can accelerate the timeline, but it'll cost extra and won't be as clean. We can have initial documents, driver's licenses, social security numbers by tonight. But the full background, the deep cover that would fool serious investigation, that still takes another week." "Tonight is better than nothing," Chris said. "What about transportation? Once the story breaks, getting to any major airport or train station becomes dangerous. Private plane, small airfield about 40 minutes from here. We lift off at midnight, land in Kentucky where my contact has a safe house prepared. From there we have options, Canada, Mexico, even Europe if we move carefully. Susan set down her fork. This is really happening. We're actually running. We're surviving, Chris corrected. There's a difference. The morning crawled by with agonizing slowness. They monitored news websites obsessively, watching for the story to break. Chris found himself alternating between dread and relief. Dread of what came next, relief that he'd finally acted instead of just surviving. At 11:45 a.m., the Philadelphia Inquirer posted a breaking news alert. Massive corruption in Philadelphia crime family exposed, exclusive documents revealed decades of criminal activity. Chris's phone started ringing immediately. Other journalists, law enforcement, even numbers he recognized from his old life. He let them all go to voicemail, watching as the story spread across news websites. The New York Times published their version at 11:52. The Washington Post followed at 12:03. Within 20 minutes it was trending on social media. Cable news was picking it up, and the story had exploded beyond any possibility of containment. "It's done," Chris said quietly. "No taking it back now." Susan read the articles on her phone, her expression shifting between satisfaction and worry. "They're not using your name as the source yet, just referring to a former high-ranking member of the organization. How long until Vincent figures out it was you? He probably already knows. The information is too detailed, too comprehensive. Only a few people had access to this level of evidence, and most of them are dead." Chris's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He opened it and felt his blood run cold. The message was simple. A photo of the cabin they were hiding in, taken from the woods, time-stamped 20 minutes ago. Below it, a single sentence. "You made your choice. Now live with it." Chris showed the phone to Diane and Susan. Diane cursed and immediately moved to the windows, checking the perimeter. Susan's face went pale. "How did they find us?" Susan whispered. "Doesn't matter now," Chris said, his military training from years ago kicking in. He grabbed the handgun, checked the magazine, positioned himself with a view of both the front door and the back exit. "We need to leave immediately." Diane was already grabbing their essential supplies, cash, documents, USB drive copies. "The SUV is still out front. If we move fast—" A window shattered, glass exploding inward. Chris tackled Susan to the ground as gunfire erupted from the tree line. Bullets tore through the cabin's thin walls, splintering wood and punching holes in furniture. The careful, methodical assassination attempt Chris had expected became a violent assault. "Stay down!" Chris shouted over the gunfire. He returned fire through the broken window, not aiming carefully but providing cover. "Diane, get Susan to the SUV. I'll hold them off." "I'm not leaving you," Susan protested. "Yes, you are." Chris fired 3 more rounds, forcing the attackers to take cover. "I got you into this. Let me get you out." Diane grabbed Susan's arm and dragged her toward the back door, moving in a crouch to stay below the windows. More gunfire shattered the remaining glass, and Chris heard multiple voices outside. At least 3 attackers, possibly more. Vincent had sent a full hit squad. Chris counted his ammunition. 7 rounds left in the magazine, 1 spare magazine in his jacket. 16 bullets total against unknown numbers. Not ideal odds, but he'd survived worse. The key was buying enough time for Susan and Diane to escape. He moved to a different window, keeping low, and caught a glimpse of movement in the trees. Chris fired twice, satisfaction sparking as one figure fell. The attackers would be more cautious now, knowing their target was armed and capable. From the back of the cabin, Chris heard an engine roar to life. Diane getting the SUV started. Good. If they could make it to the dirt road, they had a chance. The cabin was isolated, but there were other houses within a mile, other people who would hear the gunfire and call police. Time was now working in their favor. A Molotov cocktail arced through the broken window, glass bottle filled with gasoline, a burning rag stuffed in the top. It shattered against the far wall and flames immediately spread across the old wood. The cabin had been a shelter. Now it was becoming a trap. Chris fired his remaining rounds to keep the attackers suppressed, then sprinted for the back door. Smoke was already filling the small space, making his eyes water and his lungs burn. He burst through the exit just as the SUV's tires spun on the dirt. Diane accelerating hard with Susan in the passenger seat. Two men emerged from the tree line raising weapons. Chris dove for the SUV's open rear door as Diane floored the accelerator. Bullets slammed into the vehicle's side, shattering the rear window but missing the occupants. Chris pulled himself inside as the cabin receded behind them, flames now visible through multiple windows. "Everyone okay?" Diane asked, her voice tight with adrenaline. "I'm fine," Susan said, though she was shaking. "Chris?" Still breathing. Chris checked himself for injuries. Miraculously, nothing beyond scrapes from diving on the cabin floor. The SUV had taken damage, but the engine sounded solid. "How did they find us?" "Must have tracked our phones or followed us from Philadelphia," Diane said, eyes fixed on the narrow dirt road. "Vincent has resources we underestimated." Behind them, smoke rose from the cabin, a column of gray against blue sky. Chris heard sirens in the distance. Fire department, probably police. Good. Law enforcement presence would force Vincent's people to retreat, at least temporarily. "Where are we going?" Susan asked. "Away from here. We'll ditch this vehicle as soon as possible, steal another one, make it impossible to track." Diane took a sharp turn onto a paved road heading east. "The midnight flight is compromised. We need a new plan." Chris's mind raced through options, discarding each as quickly as they formed. With Vincent knowing they'd tried to flee, every planned escape route became suspect. Airports would be watched, train stations monitored, rental car agencies checked. They needed to disappear completely, and fast. "Head for Reading," Chris said. "I know someone there, completely outside the organization. Someone Vincent wouldn't think to check." "Can they be trusted?" Diane asked. "As much as anyone can be in this situation." Chris pulled out his burner phone, miraculously intact despite the chaos, and dialed a number he hadn't used in 5 years. It rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "Who's this?" "Marcus, it's Chris Moretti. I need a favor, and I need it right now." A long pause. "Chris, man, you're all over the news. The feds are looking for you. The families are looking for you. What the hell did you do?" "Something I should have done years ago. Can you help or not?" "What do you need?" "Safe house. Transportation. 3 people need to disappear for a while." Chris kept his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I know it's asking a lot, but you owe me from the Harrisburg situation." Marcus sighed heavily. "Yeah, I owe you. But Chris, this is serious heat. Helping you could get me killed." "I know, but if I don't get help, I definitely get killed. And 2 innocent women with me." Another pause, then, "There's an old warehouse on Penn Street, near the railroad tracks. It's abandoned, but the back office still has power and water. I'll meet you there in 2 hours with supplies, but that's all I can do, Chris. After that, you're on your own." 2 hours. "Thank you, Marcus." Chris ended the call and relayed the information to Diane. They drove for 90 minutes, taking side roads and avoiding main highways, the SUV's bullet holes drawing occasional stares from other drivers, but no attempts to intervene. Pennsylvania's rural landscape rolled past. Farms, small towns, industrial areas slowly reclaiming their former glory. Normal life, completely oblivious to the violence and desperation passing through. In Reading, Diane ditched the damaged SUV in a mall parking lot that wouldn't see serious traffic until the evening rush. They wiped it clean of fingerprints, grabbed their essential supplies, and walked 6 blocks to the warehouse Marcus had described. It was exactly as promised, abandoned, crumbling, but with a back section that showed signs of recent habitation. Marcus arrived right on time, driving a beat-up pickup truck and carrying duffel bags. He was mid-50s, weathered face, the kind of person who'd seen too much to be easily surprised. But even he looked shocked when he saw Chris. "You look like hell, man," Marcus said, embracing Chris briefly. "News says you turned informant." "That true?" "I gave evidence to journalists and the FBI, yes. Vincent and the old guard were destroying the organization, hurting innocent people. I had to stop it." Marcus whistled low. "That's a death sentence in our world. You know that, right?" "I'm aware." Marcus handed over the duffel bags. Cash, burner phones, some clothes that should fit you, also a car, Honda Civic, 10 years old, completely clean title under a shell company. It's parked 2 blocks over, keys in the wheel well. "Thank you, Marcus, seriously." "Don't thank me, just disappear and stay disappeared. Vincent's putting serious money on your head. $250,000 for information leading to you, $500,000 for proof you're dead. Every bounty hunter, every desperate soldier, they're all looking." Marcus glanced at Susan and Diane. These the innocent women you mentioned? This is Susan and Diane. They saved my life, and now they're targets too because of me. Marcus studied them with experienced eyes. Takes guts to help someone the whole underworld wants dead. You two have somewhere to go? Working on it, Diane said. Contacts are arranging new identities, but we need time. Then get that time somewhere far from here. Canadian border's 6 hours north. Mexico's a lot longer, but also an option. Hell, you could even go to ground in a big city where nobody knows your faces. Marcus turned back to Chris. Whatever you do, move fast. Vincent's not the only one hunting you now. The feds want you for debriefing. Other families want to make examples of you. And about 100 freelancers are chasing those bounties. After Marcus left, they transferred their supplies to the Honda Civic and studied a map. Canada made sense. Close, different jurisdiction, easier to disappear across an international border. But it also meant abandoning any hope of returning to the United States without facing immediate arrest or worse. I say we go to Canada, Susan said. Cross near Buffalo, lots of traffic there, easier to blend in. Once we're across, we can figure out long-term plans. Assuming we make it across, Diane said, Border Patrol will have alerts out for Chris's face. The moment they run identification, we're caught. Then we cross illegally. Back roads, forest paths, pay someone to smuggle us if necessary. Susan's determination had returned, the fear from the cabin attack transforming into resolve. We've come this far. We don't give up now. Chris looked at these two women who'd risked everything for him. Susan, the pizza delivery girl, who'd confronted armed mobsters with nothing but a baseball bat and courage. Diane, the legitimate businesswoman who'd thrown away her comfortable life to honor a debt. They deserved better than this desperate flight, this uncertain future. We do this. We do it smart, Chris said. No unnecessary risks. We cross the border legally if possible, illegally only as last resort. Once we're in Canada, we make contact with federal prosecutors, negotiate witness protection that extends across international borders. We survive this properly, not just temporarily. They spent the remainder of the day in the warehouse office, planning their route, monitoring news coverage of the breaking story. The FBI had indeed issued arrest warrants for Vincent and 15 other members of the organization. Federal agents had raided multiple properties, seized records, arrested several mid-level operators. The Philadelphia crime family was in complete chaos, but Vincent himself remained at large, and according to news reports, multiple law enforcement sources suggested he was leading the manhunt for Chris personally, determined to handle the betrayal himself rather than delegating to subordinates. As evening fell over Reading, Pennsylvania, Chris stood at the warehouse's dirty window, watching the city's lights flicker to life. Tomorrow they'd drive north, attempt a border crossing that could either save them or end them. Everything hung in balance. Freedom or capture, survival or death, redemption or damnation. Susan joined him at the window. What are you thinking about? About how much has changed in 72 hours, about how quickly a life can completely transform. Any regrets? Chris considered the question honestly. I regret not doing this sooner. I regret every person who got hurt before I finally acted. But I don't regret the choice itself, even with all the consequences. That's good, Susan said quietly, because there's no going back now, only forward, whatever that looks like. Behind them, Diane prepared the warehouse office for sleeping, arranging sleeping bags Marcus had provided, setting up a watch rotation to ensure security. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges, new tests of whether three unlikely allies could beat impossible odds. But for tonight, they were still alive, still together, still fighting. And in a world where Vincent DeMarco wanted them dead, that counted as victory. They left Reading before dawn, the Honda Civic blending perfectly with early morning commuter traffic. Diane drove first shift, Chris navigated, Susan monitored news and social media for updates on the manhunt. The November sun rose slowly, painting Pennsylvania farmland in muted colors. The news was simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. Federal agents had arrested 8 members of Vincent's crew overnight, including his second-in-command and his primary accountant. The organization was fracturing rapidly, with soldiers cutting deals and providing evidence to avoid prosecution. But Vincent himself remained free, and according to one troubling report, he'd emptied several offshore accounts, millions in cash that could fund a prolonged hunt. Buffalo Crossing is about 5 hours from here, Diane said, eyes fixed on the highway. But we need to think through our approach. Do we have any legitimate identification that might work? Chris shook his head. My driver's license will trigger immediate alerts. We need different identities, or we cross illegally. I have an idea, Susan said from the back seat. She'd been typing on her phone, researching border crossing procedures and potential vulnerabilities. There are dozens of unmonitored roads along the New York-Canada border. Locals use them all the time. If we avoid official checkpoints entirely, we could drive across without ever encountering Border Patrol. That's illegal entry into Canada, Diane pointed out. Even if we make it across, we'd be undocumented immigrants subject to deportation. Better than being dead, Susan countered. Once we're safely in Canada, we contact federal prosecutors from there, negotiate protection and proper status. But first we survive. They drove in tense silence for another hour, each processing the reality of what they were attempting. Chris found himself thinking about his old life, the power, the respect, the sense of control. All of it had been illusion, he realized now. Real power wasn't commanding soldiers or controlling territory. Real power was having the strength to walk away from everything and start over. Near Scranton, they stopped for gas and supplies. Chris stayed in the car, keeping his face turned away from security cameras, while Diane and Susan handled the purchases. Through the gas station window, Chris watched other travelers, families on road trips, truckers on long hauls, college students heading home for Thanksgiving, normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that a fugitive mob boss sat 30 feet away. A Pennsylvania State Police cruiser pulled into the gas station, and Chris's heart rate spiked. The officer, young, probably late 20s, got out to pump gas, his eyes scanning the vehicles with professional wariness. Chris forced himself to breathe normally, to appear calm despite the fear coursing through him. The officer's gaze swept over the Honda, lingered for just a moment, then moved on. Chris exhaled slowly. The car was clean, registered properly, gave no obvious cause for suspicion. Still, the close call reminded him how precarious their situation remained. Every interaction, every moment in public, carried the risk of recognition and capture. Diane and Susan returned with coffee, sandwiches, and a Pennsylvania map, showing rural roads near the border. I've been thinking, Diane said as she started the car. We cross near a town called Allegheny, New York. There's a county road that dead ends at the border, but continues on the Canadian side. If we time it for late evening, we might be able to cross without encountering anyone. And if we do encounter Border Patrol, Chris asked, then we run or surrender. But at least we tried. Diane pulled back onto the highway. I'm tired of being hunted, Chris. I'm tired of looking over my shoulder every minute. We make this crossing work or we don't. Either way, it ends soon. The miles accumulated. They passed through Binghamton, crossed into New York, headed northwest toward Lake Erie. The landscape transformed gradually, farms giving way to forests, elevation increasing, temperature dropping as they moved north. By early afternoon, they were within an hour of the border. Chris's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was Philadelphia. He answered cautiously. Chris Moretti, a woman's voice, official and firm. Who's calling? Special Agent Rebecca Torres, FBI Philadelphia Field Office. We need to talk about your situation. Chris put the phone on speaker so Diane and Susan could hear. I'm listening. We've been analyzing the evidence you provided to journalists. It's comprehensive, damning, and exactly what we need to dismantle Vincent DeMarco's operation. I'm authorized to offer you full witness protection in exchange for your cooperation and testimony. What about the 2 women helping me? They're targets now because they saved my life. We can extend protection to them as well. New identities, relocation, financial support to establish new lives. But we need you to come in, Mr. Moretti. Running to Canada won't solve anything. DeMarco has resources across the border too. Chris glanced at Diane and Susan, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in their expressions. Federal protection was the logical choice. Legal, structured, designed specifically for situations like this. But it also meant surrendering control, trusting a system that had proven corruptible in the past. How do I know Vincent doesn't have people in your office? Chris asked. My files show payoffs to multiple federal agents. Those agents have been suspended pending investigation. My team is clean, I guarantee it. We've been building a case against DeMarco for 3 years. Your evidence accelerated our timeline, but we were already moving on him. Agent Torres paused. I understand your reluctance to trust law enforcement. Your entire life has taught you we're the enemy, but right now, we're your best chance at survival. I need to think about it. Don't think too long. Every hour you're out there, the danger increases. Call this number back within 24 hours, and we'll arrange a secure extraction." Agent Torres ended the call. Diane pulled the car onto a rest stop exit and parked. They sat in silence, engine idling, watching other travelers come and go. The choice before them was stark: continue running and hope they could outmaneuver Vincent indefinitely, or trust federal protection and accept its constraints. "What do you think?" Chris finally asked. Susan spoke first. "I think Agent Torres is right that running to Canada isn't a permanent solution, but I also think surrendering to federal custody feels like giving up. We've fought this far. Part of me wants to see it through. We're exhausted, we're scared, and we're making life-or-death decisions in a parking lot," Diane said. "Maybe that's exactly when we should trust the professionals designed to handle situations like this." Chris got out of the car and walked to the edge of the rest stop, looking out over New York's gray November landscape. He'd spent 2 decades avoiding federal scrutiny, teaching his soldiers to never cooperate with law enforcement under any circumstances. The Code of Omerta had governed his entire adult life, but that code had also protected men like Vincent, had enabled decades of violence and corruption, had prioritized loyalty to criminals over basic humanity. Breaking it had felt like betrayal. Now it felt like liberation. He pulled out his phone and dialed Agent Torres back. "I'll cooperate," Chris said when she answered, "but I have conditions. Full protection for Susan Martinez and Diane Russo. No prosecution for any assistance they've provided me. New identities that allow them to rebuild legitimate lives." "Agreed. Where are you now?" "Near the Canadian border. We were planning to cross illegally tonight." "Stay where you are. I'm coordinating with FBI field offices in Buffalo and Syracuse. We'll have agents to you within 90 minutes. Find somewhere public but secure. A police station would be ideal." "No police stations. Vincent might have local connections. We'll wait at a hospital, plenty of people around, hard for anyone to make a move without witnesses." "Acceptable. Nearest major hospital to your location?" Chris checked the GPS on his phone. "Olean General Hospital. We'll be in the main lobby." 90 minutes, Mr. Moretti. Stay visible, stay safe, and don't change your mind." Agent Torres ended the call. Chris returned to the car and explained his decision. Susan looked relieved. Diane appeared skeptical, but neither argued. They were all running on fumes. Physical exhaustion, emotional depletion, the accumulated stress of days spent in constant fear. The drive to Olean took 30 minutes. The hospital was a modern facility on the edge of town, glass and steel gleaming in afternoon light. They parked in the main lot, gathered their essentials, and walked into the lobby as a group. Inside was warmth, fluorescent brightness, the controlled chaos of a busy hospital. Families waited for news of loved ones in surgery. Elderly patients sat in wheelchairs awaiting transport. Nurses moved with efficient purpose. It was profoundly normal, almost jarring in its mundane safety. They found seats in a corner with good visibility of all entrances. Chris kept the handgun concealed in his jacket, but within easy reach. Every person who entered drew his attention. Was that person a federal agent, one of Vincent's soldiers, or just an innocent hospital visitor? 60 minutes passed, then 75. Chris's anxiety increased with each minute beyond the promised 90. Had Agent Torres been lying? Was this a setup? Were they walking into capture rather than protection? At 92 minutes, a woman in a business suit entered the lobby, scanning the room with practiced efficiency. Her eyes locked on Chris, and she approached with FBI credentials already displayed. "Mr. Moretti, I'm Special Agent Sarah Chen. Agent Torres sent me and my team to bring you in. We have a secure vehicle waiting outside." "How do I know you're actually FBI and not Vincent's people?" Chris asked quietly. Agent Chen pulled out her phone and called a number, handing the device to Chris. Agent Torres's voice came through immediately. "Mr. Moretti, it's Rebecca Torres. Agent Chen is legitimate, part of my team. You can trust her." "Okay." Chris handed the phone back to Agent Chen. "We're ready." They left the hospital surrounded by 4 FBI agents in plainclothes, moving quickly to a convoy of black SUVs with tinted windows. Chris climbed into the rear vehicle with Susan and Diane, finally allowing himself to believe they might actually survive this. The drive to Buffalo's FBI field office took 2 hours. During that time, Agent Chen explained the process: interviews to document Chris's knowledge, preparation for eventual testimony, establishment of new identities through the US. Marshals Service Witness Protection Program. It was structured, bureaucratic, exhaustingly thorough. What about Vincent? Chris asked. Have you located him? Not yet, but we will. His organization is collapsing. Soldiers are turning on each other. Evidence is pouring in, assets are being frozen. It's only a matter of time. Agent Chen's expression was confident. And with your testimony, we'll have enough to put him away for multiple life sentences. Night had fallen by the time they reached Buffalo's FBI office, a nondescript building in an industrial area. Security was intense. Multiple checkpoints, ID verification, metal detectors. They were led to a secure conference room on the 3rd floor, where Agent Torres waited with a team of prosecutors and investigators. Mr. Moretti, welcome, Agent Torres said, extending her hand. She was 40-something, African-American, with the bearing of someone who'd risen through difficult ranks. I know this wasn't an easy decision, but you've made the right choice. Over the next 6 hours, Chris walked them through everything. Financial crimes, money laundering networks, connections to corrupt officials, details of unsolved murders, organizational structure, operational procedures. The prosecutors took notes, asked clarifying questions, built the case methodically. Susan and Diane gave their own statements in separate rooms, detailing their involvement and confirming Chris's account. By 2 a.m. everyone was exhausted, running on coffee and determination. That's enough for tonight, Agent Torres said finally. We'll resume in the morning. For now, you'll stay in secure housing we've arranged. Marshals will provide protection until your identities are established. They were driven to a safe house in a quiet suburb, a normal-looking 2-story home that happened to have reinforced doors, security cameras, and 2 U.S. Marshals on permanent watch. Inside was comfortable but impersonal. Government-issued furniture, generic decorations, the kind of space designed to be temporarily habitable but never home. Chris stood at the bedroom window, looking out at suburban Buffalo. Somewhere out there, Vincent was still hunting, still determined to make an example of the boss who'd betrayed everything. But for the first time in days, Chris felt something resembling safety. Susan appeared in the doorway. Can't sleep? Too much adrenaline still running through my system. Chris turned to face her. I never properly thanked you for everything. You saved my life in that pizza shop, and you've risked yourself repeatedly since then. Why? Susan leaned against the doorframe. I told you. My brother, my principles, all of that. But honestly, I don't fully know. Maybe because someone needed to. Maybe because I was tired of feeling powerless in my own life. Maybe because you looked like someone who could be saved, if only someone tried. I'm not sure I deserved saving. Probably not, Susan agreed with a slight smile. But who does? We're all just people trying to do better than we did yesterday. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we fail, but at least we tried. Chris felt something crack inside him. The armor he'd built over decades of criminal life, the emotional distance necessary to do terrible things without breaking. Tears surprised him. Unwelcome and unstoppable. Grief for everything lost and relief for what remained. Susan crossed the room and embraced him. Not romantic, but deeply human, one wounded person supporting another. They stood like that for a long moment, 2 survivors holding each other up in the aftermath of disaster. We're going to be okay, Susan said quietly. All 3 of us. New names, new lives, new chances to be better than who we were. That's more than most people get. I hope you're right, Chris whispered. I am, Susan said with certainty he wished he could share, because we've already survived the worst part. Now we just have to survive the rebuilding. 3 months passed in the strange limbo of federal protection. Chris, Susan and Diane lived in government safe houses that changed every few weeks, always moving, never settling, waiting for the trial that would either end Vincent DeMarco's freedom or end their safety. Chris spent his days in endless debriefing sessions, walking prosecutors through decades of criminal activity with excruciating detail. He drew organizational charts, explained financial schemes, identified corrupt officials, and relived violent acts he'd rather forget. It was exhausting and humiliating, not the testimony itself, but confronting the full weight of what he'd been part of. Susan used the time to finish her nursing degree online, federal funds covering tuition as part of her witness protection arrangement. She studied with renewed purpose, channeling the trauma of recent months into motivation. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd left nursing school to support her family, and now criminal circumstances had given her the opportunity to return. Diane rebuilt her import-export business from scratch under her new identity, using seed money from liquidated assets and federal assistance. She was remarkably resilient, treating the upheaval as just another business challenge to overcome. "I've rebuilt once before," she told Chris during one of their shared dinners in yet another temporary home. "I can do it again." Vincent remained at large throughout those months, a ghost haunting the edges of their new lives. He'd gone underground after the initial FBI raids, abandoning his former territory, but not his vendetta. Twice federal agents intercepted assassination attempts, once a hired sniper in Cleveland, once a car bomb in Pittsburgh. Vincent was spending his offshore millions on revenge, determined that if he couldn't have his empire, Chris wouldn't have life. The trial began in March, 5 months after the Philadelphia Inquirer broke the story that had changed everything. Federal prosecutors had assembled an overwhelming case, Chris's testimony, corroborating witnesses from within the organization, financial records, surveillance evidence. Vincent faced charges that would keep him in prison until death: racketeering, murder conspiracy, money laundering, corruption of public officials. Chris took the stand on the trial's third day. The courtroom was packed: media, law enforcement, family members of Vincent's victims. And there at the defense table sat Vincent himself, finally captured 3 weeks earlier in a safe house outside Atlantic City. He'd aged visibly, thinner, harder, eyes burning with hatred that Chris felt physically across the courtroom. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Bradford, led Chris through his testimony methodically. "Mr. Moretti, how long were you part of the Philadelphia crime family?" 23 years total, 5 years as boss before being removed. "And during that time, were you personally involved in criminal activities?" "Yes. Money laundering, extortion, loan sharking, orchestrating violence. I was fully complicit in the organization's operations." Chris's voice was steady despite his internal turmoil. Admitting these things publicly under oath was a different kind of exposure than the private debriefings. "Why did you decide to cooperate with federal authorities?" Chris looked directly at the jury. 12 ordinary citizens whose faces showed varying degrees of interest and judgment. "Because Vincent DeMarco tried to have me killed, and in the process, he hurt innocent people who'd done nothing but help someone in need. I realized the organization I'd helped build was destroying lives, and I had the power to stop it. Some might say you're only cooperating to save yourself, that your motives are selfish rather than moral." "They'd be partly right," Chris admitted. "I wanted to survive, but I also wanted to prevent more people from suffering the way people I'd come to care about had suffered because of this life." Vincent's defense attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Monroe, cross-examined aggressively. "Mr. Moretti, isn't it true you participated in everything you're now testifying about? That you enriched yourself through these same criminal activities?" "Yes. And isn't it true you only came forward after losing a power struggle within the organization?" "I came forward after Vincent tried to have me executed and then terrorized innocent civilians." "But you participated in similar violence for years, didn't you? Ordering assaults, approving murders, destroying businesses that wouldn't comply with extortion demands." Chris felt the weight of every past decision pressing down. "Yes, I did all of those things. I'm not claiming to be innocent or redeemed. I'm simply telling the truth about what Vincent DeMarco ordered and participated in." "The truth, or a carefully constructed story to save yourself from prosecution?" "The truth, supported by documentation, recordings, and testimony from multiple witnesses who have nothing to gain by lying." The cross-examination continued for 6 brutal hours across 2 days. Attorney Monroe tried to discredit Chris's character, question his motivations, suggest he was framing Vincent to eliminate a rival. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. Financial records that matched Chris's testimony precisely, recorded conversations that confirmed his accounts, other witnesses who corroborated key details. Susan testified on the trial's 8th day, describing how she'd witnessed Vincent's soldiers terrorizing Tony's pizza shop and the Vietnamese restaurant, how she'd treated Chris's gunshot wound, how they'd barely escaped the cabin attack. Her testimony was powerful because of its ordinary nature. She wasn't a criminal, just a person who'd tried to help and been targeted for it. "Did Mr. Moretti ever threaten you or force you to help him?" Prosecutor Bradford asked. "No. He repeatedly told me to leave to save myself. I chose to stay and help because it was the right thing to do." even though it put you in grave danger. My brother died because criminals like Vincent DeMarco use people and throw them away. I wasn't going to let that happen again if I could prevent it. Diane's testimony reinforced the prosecution's narrative. Vincent's organization had systematically terrorized anyone who helped Chris, demonstrating a pattern of violence that extended far beyond traditional mob warfare into attacks on complete civilians. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution presented 68 witnesses, thousands of pages of documents, hours of recorded conversations. Vincent's defense tried to paint Chris as a disgruntled former boss, fabricating evidence, but the sheer volume of corroborating material made that theory impossible to sustain. On a warm April afternoon, the jury returned after 8 hours of deliberation. The verdict was read in a silent courtroom, guilty on all 43 counts. Vincent showed no emotion as the judge scheduled sentencing for 2 months later, but his eyes found Chris one final time. The look contained no words but communicated everything. This isn't over, you're marked forever. You'll never truly be free. Chris held that gaze without flinching. He'd accepted months ago that cooperating meant permanent exile from his former life. But watching Vincent led away in chains, knowing the organization that had terrorized Philadelphia for decades was finally broken, made the cost feel worthwhile. Outside the courthouse, Susan and Chris stood together while Diane spoke with federal agents about next steps. The spring sun was warm, cherry blossoms were blooming, and life was continuing with determined normalcy. "How do you feel?" Susan asked. "Relieved, exhausted, terrified about what comes next." Chris watched people on the street, office workers, students, tourists, all living ordinary lives he'd never truly experienced. "The marshals say our new identities are ready. We can relocate anywhere in the country, start completely fresh. Any ideas where you want to go? Somewhere quiet. Somewhere I can figure out who Chris Moretti becomes when he's not a criminal." Chris turned to Susan. "What about you? You've got your nursing degree almost finished. You could go anywhere, do anything." Susan was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking, maybe we don't split up. Maybe the three of us relocate together, stay connected. We've survived too much to just disappear into separate lives. You'd want that, after everything I put you through. You didn't put me through anything I didn't choose. And yeah, I'd want that. Diane and I talked about it. We're family now, not by blood, but by shared trauma and survival. Might as well stay together." The simple generosity of her words struck Chris deeply. He'd spent decades in a world where loyalty was transactional, where people stayed close only as long as you had power or money. Susan and Diane offered something different, genuine connection forged in crisis and maintained despite every reason to walk away. "I'd like that too," Chris said quietly. Diane joined them, finished with her federal consultations. "Marshals are proposing Montana or Oregon, small cities, good infrastructure, easy to blend in. We'd have support for the first year, housing assistance, job placement, monitoring to ensure Vincent's remaining associates don't find us." "Montana sounds good," Susan said. "Wide open spaces, fresh start, about as different from South Philadelphia as we can get." They made the decision that afternoon, standing outside a federal courthouse in Buffalo, New York. 3 people who'd been strangers 5 months ago and were now bonded by shared survival. Montana it would be, specifically Missoula, a college town big enough to offer opportunities but small enough to avoid the surveillance that came with major cities. The transition took another month. Federal agents helped them establish new identities. Christopher Mason, a former business consultant starting a security firm. Susan Torres, a nursing student completing her degree. Diane Parker, import-export specialist expanding to Western markets. The names felt foreign, but they practiced using them until the unfamiliarity faded. They flew to Montana in early June, the landscape below shifting from eastern cities to Midwestern plains to Rocky Mountain grandeur. Chris had rarely left the Philadelphia area in his adult life. His world had been contained within the organization's territory. Now that world was expanding in ways both terrifying and liberating. Missoula was beautiful. Mountains on all sides, a river running through downtown, the kind of place where people smiled at strangers and left their doors unlocked. The federal government had arranged a 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, modern but not ostentatious, the kind of place where 3 people starting over could build normal lives. Susan enrolled in the University of Montana's nursing program to complete her final semester. Diane opened a small import business focused on artisan goods, using her expertise, but on a dramatically smaller scale. Chris struggled most with the transition. His entire adult identity had been tied to power and violence, and now he was supposed to become an ordinary citizen. He started volunteering at a community center, teaching self-defense classes to at-risk youth. It was modest work, nothing like commanding an organization, but it felt purposeful in ways his old life never had. The kids didn't know his history, didn't care about his past. They just wanted to learn how to protect themselves, and Chris could teach them that without the criminal context that had defined his former expertise. 2 years passed in Missoula, Montana. 2 years of building something resembling normal life, of learning to exist without constantly checking for threats, of becoming people they'd never imagined being. But the past has long fingers, and some shadows never fully fade. Chris, now Christopher Mason, had just finished teaching his Wednesday evening self-defense class when his phone rang. The number was blocked, always a warning sign. He almost didn't answer, but something made him click accept. Hello? Silence. Then a familiar voice, aged and rough but unmistakable. Chris, it's been a while. Vincent. Chris's blood went cold. How did you get this number? Doesn't matter. What matters is that I know where you are. Missoula's a nice town. Quiet, peaceful. Good place to hide and pretend you're someone else. You're in prison. You'll die in prison. This conversation is being monitored. Chris was already moving toward his car, mind racing through security protocols the marshals had drilled into him. Prison's just another kind of neighborhood, Chris, and in every neighborhood there are people who owe favors, who can be bought, who want to prove themselves. Vincent's voice carried satisfaction. I've had 2 years to be patient, 2 years to plan, 2 years to make connections with people who can reach outside these walls. If you're threatening me, I'm not threatening, I'm informing. You took everything from me, my freedom, my organization, my legacy. Now I'm going to take everything from you, starting with the people you care about. The line went dead. Chris immediately called his federal marshal contact, Agent Williams, who'd been their primary liaison since relocation. Vincent made contact. He knows where we are. That's impossible. Your identities are sealed, locations classified. How could he? Agent Williams paused. Stay where you are. I'm sending a protection team immediately. Do not go home. Do not contact Susan or Diane. We'll handle extraction. But Chris was already driving, protocol forgotten in the surge of fear for Susan and Diane. He called Susan's number, no answer. Diane's number, straight to voicemail. His heart pounded as he navigated Missoula's streets toward their shared house, seeing threat in every shadow. He arrived to find the house dark, no cars in the driveway. Chris approached cautiously, hand on the weapon he'd kept despite federal recommendations to remain unarmed. The front door was unlocked. Wrong, they never left it unlocked, and Chris entered with every sense screaming danger. The house was empty, but showed signs of recent occupancy. Susan's textbooks on the dining table, Diane's laptop open in the office, coffee cups still warm. They'd been here minutes ago. Chris searched systematically, looking for signs of struggle, finding nothing until he reached the kitchen. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet, was a photograph. Susan and Diane at a coffee shop downtown, taken recently based on their clothing. Across the bottom, written in marker, "They're safe, for now. We need to talk. Come alone to the old lumber mill on River Road, midnight. Come armed and they die." Chris stared at the photo, rage and fear warring in his chest. Vincent couldn't reach them personally. He was in federal supermax prison in Colorado, but he'd found proxies, people willing to do his bidding for money or reputation. The organization had been broken, but pieces remained, and some of those pieces were loyal to Vincent's memory of power. Agent Williams called back. "Protection team is 5 minutes out. Stay put, let us handle this. Vincent's people have Susan and Diane. They want me at the lumber mill at midnight, alone. Then we set up an operation, surround the location, extract the hostages professionally. You do not go in alone, that's exactly what they want. And if I don't go, they kill 2 innocent women who only helped me because I was desperate and they were kind." Chris's voice was steel. "I'm not hiding behind federal protection while they die. Chris, listen to me carefully. You go to that mill alone, you die. That's the only outcome. Vincent wants you dead, and this is the trap. Then it's a trap I'm walking into." Chris ended the call and checked his weapon. Full magazine, round-chambered, safety off. He had 6 hours until midnight, 6 hours to prepare for whatever Vincent's people had planned. The marshals would come, would try to stop him, or set up their own operation. Chris needed to move faster, needed to reach the mill before federal intervention complicated everything. He left the house and drove toward the industrial area near the Clark Fork River, where the old lumber mill sat abandoned for decades. The mill was a massive structure of rotting wood and rusted metal, a monument to Missoula's timber industry past. Chris had driven past it dozens of times without paying attention, never imagining it would become the site of his final confrontation with Vincent's legacy. He parked 3 blocks away and approached on foot, moving through shadows with skills learned decades ago and never quite forgotten. The mill was dark, apparently empty, but Chris knew better. Someone was here, watching, waiting for midnight. Chris found a position with good sight lines and settled in to wait. The November night was freezing, Montana cold cutting through his jacket, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused on the tactical problem: unknown number of hostiles, 2 hostages to protect, limited backup, and a ticking clock. At 11:30 p.m., vehicles approached, 2 black SUVs that parked near the mill's main entrance. 6 men emerged, all armed, moving with military precision. Professional, not street thugs. Vincent had hired quality people for this. At 11:45 p.m., another vehicle arrived, a sedan. 2 more men emerged, and between them, hands bound, were Susan and Diane. Even from a distance, Chris could see they were terrified, but unharmed. The men led them into the mill, and lights flickered on inside, illuminating the cavernous interior. Chris's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Midnight, front entrance, alone. Any tricks, and they die screaming. He had 15 minutes to decide. Trust federal agents who would arrive soon and potentially escalate the situation into a bloodbath, or walk into the mill alone and hope he could outmaneuver Vincent's hired killers. The choice was simple. Susan and Diane had saved him when they had every reason to run. Now it was his turn to save them, whatever the cost. At 11:58 p.m., Chris emerged from his hiding spot and walked toward the mill's entrance, hands visible and empty. The armed men watched him approach, weapons trained on his chest. Chris fought every instinct, screaming to take cover, to fight, to survive. "Christopher Moretti," one of the men said, tall, scarred, with a New Jersey accent. "Vincent sends his regards." Vincent's in prison. Vincent's everywhere, in our memories, our loyalty, our code. You betrayed that, and betrayal requires payment. The man gestured toward the mill. Inside, slowly, Chris entered the mill, the interior lit by construction lights that cast harsh shadows. Susan and Diane were bound to metal support pillars, both trying to project calm, but clearly terrified. Chris met Susan's eyes, seeing anger and fear and something else. Trust that he'd find a way out of this. "Chris, you shouldn't have come," Diane said, her voice hoarse. "They were always going to kill us. Now they'll kill you too." "Quiet," the scarred man ordered. He turned to Chris. "Vincent wanted us to deliver a message before you die. He says you were right. The old ways were dying, the organization needed to change, but you went about it wrong. You should have died with the old ways instead of betraying them." "Vincent was destroying the organization and calling it tradition," Chris said calmly. "I just accelerated the inevitable. Maybe, but now you pay for that acceleration." The scarred man raised his weapon, pointing it at Chris's chest. "Any last words?" Chris looked at Susan and Diane, then back at his executioner. "Just one question. Did Vincent pay you enough to die for him?" The scarred man frowned. "What?" The mill's loading dock door exploded inward, federal agents pouring through in full tactical gear. "FBI, drop your weapons, drop them now!" Chaos erupted. Vincent's hired killers returned fire, muzzle flashes lighting the mill interior like strobes. Chris dove for cover, crawling towards Susan and Diane while bullets shredded the air above him. Federal agents advanced with disciplined precision, overwhelming the smaller force with superior numbers and training. The firefight lasted maybe 90 seconds, though it felt infinite. When silence finally fell, 4 of Vincent's men were down, 2 dead, 2 wounded. The remaining 2 had surrendered, hands raised, weapons dropped. The scarred man lay motionless in a spreading pool of blood. Chris reached Susan and Diane, cutting their bonds with a knife from one of the fallen men. "Are you hurt? Did they harm you?" "We're okay," Susan said, her voice shaking. "Scared, but okay. How did the FBI know to come?" Agent Williams emerged from the tactical team, removing his helmet. "Because Chris called me and I tracked his phone. Did you really think I'd let you walk into this alone?" Chris helped Susan and Diane to their feet, supporting them both as they moved toward the exit. Outside, the Montana night was alive with flashing lights, FBI vehicles, ambulances, local police responding to the gunfire. The quiet neighborhood Chris had built was shattered, once again replaced by violence and chaos. They spent the next 6 hours in federal custody, not arrested but secured, protected, debriefed about what had happened and how Vincent had located them. The answer, it turned out, was corruption within the Witness Protection Program itself. A clerk in the U.S. Marshals Service had been bribed to leak information about protected witnesses, and Chris's file had been among those compromised. "We're shutting down the entire security breach," Agent Williams explained, as dawn broke over Missoula. "The clerk's been arrested, all compromised witnesses are being relocated, and we're implementing new protocols. But Chris, Susan, Diane, you can't stay in Missoula. Too many people know you're here now, and while we arrested Vincent's team, there may be others." "So we run again," Susan said, exhaustion clear in every word. "New names, new city, new lives. Or," Agent Williams said carefully, "we offer an alternative. Vincent's influence in prison is being neutralized. He's being transferred to administrative segregation, no contact with outside world, monitoring of all communications. The organization that once supported him is fractured beyond recovery. You could choose to stay in Missoula, live openly under federal protection until the residual threats are eliminated." "How long would that take?" Diane asked. "Months, maybe a year, but eventually you'd be free. No more hiding, no more running, just normal lives under your chosen names." Chris looked at Susan and Diane, seeing his own exhaustion reflected in their faces. They'd been running for over 2 years, rebuilding twice, living under the constant weight of fear. The prospect of finally stopping, of defending the ground they'd claimed, held tremendous appeal. "I say we stay," Susan said. "We've built something here. Friends, careers, a life. I'm tired of abandoning everything every time Vincent or his legacy reaches for us. Let's make a stand." "Agreed," Diane said. "We stay, we fight. We finish this properly." Chris nodded slowly. "We stay, but I want maximum protection, agents assigned permanently, monitoring, the full package. No more chances for Vincent to reach us." "Done," Agent Williams said. "Welcome to the final chapter of Vincent DeMarco's influence over your lives." 6 months later, Christopher Mason stood in his security consulting office, watching Missoula's summer sun paint the mountains gold. The federal protection had worked. Vincent had been isolated completely, his prison communications severed, his remaining associates arrested or scattered. The Philadelphia crime family existed now only in history books and documentary films. Susan had graduated with her nursing degree and accepted a position at Providence St. Patrick Hospital's emergency department. She loved the work, the immediate impact of saving lives in crisis situations. It felt like redemption for all the violence she'd witnessed. Every patient she helped was proof that good could emerge from trauma. Diane's import business had flourished, expanding beyond artisan goods into sustainable products from developing nations. She'd found purpose in ethical business, using her expertise to help small producers reach American markets while avoiding the exploitation that characterized so much international trade. The three of them still lived together in the house federal agents had initially secured, though they'd long since paid off the government and owned it outright. Family by choice rather than blood, bound by shared survival and genuine affection. Chris's security consulting focused on helping domestic violence survivors and witnesses in criminal cases protect themselves, teaching ordinary people the skills he'd learned in an extraordinary life. It was modest work, nowhere near the power or money of his former existence, but it felt meaningful in ways running a crime family never had. On this particular summer evening, Chris was preparing for something he'd never imagined 2 years ago. Susan had invited him to her hospital's fundraising gala as her date, not as business associates or roommates, but as something more undefined but promising. Their relationship had evolved slowly, carefully, from crisis companions to friends to something deeper. Diane entered the office, impeccably dressed for the same gala. "You nervous? About a hospital fundraiser?" "No." "About navigating whatever Susan and I are becoming?" "Absolutely. You know what you are. You're two people who survived impossible circumstances and found each other in the wreckage. That's worth exploring, even if it's scary. Diane adjusted Chris's tie with practiced efficiency. Besides, you've faced down mob assassins. Surely you can handle a formal dinner. The gala was held at a restored theater downtown. Missoula's elite gathered to support the hospital's trauma center expansion. Susan looked stunning in a blue dress that caught the light when she moved, her dark hair styled professionally. The woman who'd confronted armed mobsters with a baseball bat transformed into elegant confidence. "You clean up nice," Susan said when Chris approached. "So do you, though I'll always remember you in a pizza shop apron, threatening hitmen with sporting equipment." Susan laughed, the sound genuine and free. Different life, different person. Same stubbornness, though. They mingled through the evening, Chris surprised by how easily he navigated social situations when violence wasn't the subtext. People here were doctors, lawyers, business owners, successful but ordinary, living lives defined by careers and families rather than territories and power. During dinner, Susan leaned close and spoke quietly. "I got a letter today from Mai, the restaurant owner's daughter who helped us escape that morning. She tracked me down through the Victims Assistance Program. Is she okay?" "She's good. Her father recovered, they rebuilt the restaurant. She's in college now, studying business. She wrote to thank us. Said seeing me stand up to those men inspired her to be braver in her own life." Susan's eyes glistened slightly. "We changed things, Chris. Not just by taking down Vincent, but by showing people that you can fight back against violence and win." The weight of that legacy settled on Chris differently than his old reputation had. In his former life, people feared him. Now, at least a few people were inspired by him. It was a small shift, but it meant everything. After the gala, they walked along the Clark Fork River. Montana's summer night, warm and clear, stars visible despite the city lights. The mill where they'd nearly died stood dark in the distance, already being demolished to make room for a new development. "Do you ever regret it?" Susan asked. "Giving up power, becoming a witness, rebuilding from nothing?" Chris considered the question honestly. "I regret the years I spent believing power mattered more than people. I regret every life I helped destroy in service of an organization that would have eventually destroyed me. But the choice to walk away, to help you and Diane survive, to finally do something right, no regrets there. Even though it cost you everything, it didn't cost me everything. It cost me the things that were killing me slowly. What I have now, this life, this city, you and Diane, that's not nothing. That's actually everything that matters." They reached a bridge over the river, leaning against the railing to watch water flow beneath them. Chris thought about the journey that had brought him here, from a parking garage assassination attempt to a Philadelphia pizza shop, from hiding in a cabin to testifying in federal court, from running to Montana to finally standing still. "Susan, I need to tell you something," Chris said, turning to face her directly. "These past 2 years, rebuilding with you and Diane, learning to be someone other than a criminal, it's been the most difficult and most rewarding experience of my life. And a significant part of that reward is getting to know you, really know you, beyond the crisis we survived together." Susan smiled softly. "Is this you asking if we can be more than friends and roommates?" "I guess it is. Awkwardly, given I'm a 50-something former mob boss with multiple life sentences worth of baggage, and you're a brilliant young woman who should probably run far away from complications like me. 50-something. You're 44, Christopher Mason. And yes, you have baggage. So do I, dead brother. Interrupted education, trauma from watching my father figure beaten by criminals. We're both damaged goods." Susan moved closer, her hand finding his. "But maybe damaged goods belong together. Maybe we understand each other in ways undamaged people never could." Chris kissed her then, gentle and tentative, two people scared of ruining what they'd built, but more scared of not trying. When they finally separated, both were smiling. "So what now?" Chris asked. "Now we keep building, keep healing, keep becoming better versions of who we were." Susan threaded her fingers through his. "No more running, no more hiding. Just forward, together, one day at a time." They walked back to their house hand in hand, talking about plans and dreams with a freedom neither had known before. Diane was already home, and when they entered, she took one look at their expressions and grinned. Finally, "I was wondering how long you two would dance around the obvious." They stayed up late that night, the three of them, sharing wine and laughter and stories about their day. It was profoundly ordinary, roommates unwinding after work, and profoundly extraordinary for people who'd nearly died multiple times. Christopher Mason, who had been Chris Moretti, who had commanded a criminal empire and lost everything and found something better in the ruins. He felt something close to peace. The past would always exist, always cast shadows, but it didn't have to define the future. Vincent DeMarco remained in prison, his influence finally broken, his threats neutralized by time and federal prosecution. The Philadelphia crime family had dissolved, its members scattered or imprisoned, its territory absorbed by legitimate businesses or other organizations. The world Chris had known was gone completely, but a new world had emerged, smaller, quieter, infinitely more genuine. A world where a former mob boss could teach self-defense to at-risk youth, where a pizza delivery girl could become a trauma nurse, where a businesswoman could build ethical enterprises. A world where 3 unlikely survivors could become family and build lives worth living. As summer faded into autumn and then winter, Chris settled into his new existence with increasing comfort. The hypervigilance faded gradually, replaced by the ordinary awareness of someone living a normal life. He stopped checking for threats in every shadow, stopped sleeping with a weapon in reach, stopped viewing every stranger as potential danger. On a snowy December evening, almost 3 years after that first desperate night at Tony's Pizza, Chris proposed to Susan. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet question over dinner in their shared house, Diane present as witness and family. Susan said yes without hesitation, and they began planning a small wedding for the following spring. The guest list was modest. Diane, Agent Williams, who'd become a genuine friend, a few colleagues from the hospital and Chris's consulting business, Mai, who flew in from Philadelphia. No family from their former lives, no connections to who they'd been, just the people who knew and accepted who they'd become. The wedding took place in May, in a garden overlooking the Clark Fork River. Susan wore a simple dress, Chris a suit that fit his new identity perfectly. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, there was only happy silence. No ghosts from the past, no threats interrupting their future. "I never thought I'd get this," Chris said during his vows, his voice thick with emotion. "A second chance, a clean slate, a love built on honesty instead of fear. You saved my life, Susan, in every way a person can be saved, and I promise to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that gift." Susan's vows were simpler, but no less powerful. "You showed me that people can change, that redemption is real, that courage sometimes means accepting help instead of going it alone. I love you, Christopher Mason, for who you are now and who you're becoming, and I promise to keep becoming better alongside you." They kissed as husband and wife, 2 people who'd found each other in the wreckage of his old life and built something beautiful from the ruins. The reception was joyful, full of laughter and dancing and celebration. Diane gave a toast that had everyone crying and laughing simultaneously. Agent Williams shared stories about the investigation that brought them together, carefully edited to preserve classified information. Mai spoke about inspiration and courage and choosing to fight instead of accepting violence. As the evening wound down and guests departed, Chris and Susan stood together watching the sun set over Montana's mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "No regrets?" Susan asked, echoing her question from months earlier. "None," Chris said with complete certainty. This life, this moment, it's worth everything it cost to get here." They drove away from the reception in Diane's gift, a restored vintage car, clean title, no connections to any past. Their honeymoon would be simple, a week in a cabin in Glacier National Park, no phones, no connections, just 2 people learning to be married without the shadow of crisis. Behind them, Missoula glowed in the twilight, a city that had become home in ways Philadelphia never had. Somewhere in that city, Diane was returning to the house they'd shared, probably already planning improvements and plotting business expansions. Somewhere, Vincent sat in a prison cell, his empire destroyed, his influence eliminated, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. And somewhere, the young man Chris Moretti had been, ambitious, violent, believing power was everything, had finally found peace by learning that power was actually nothing compared to love, redemption, and the courage to start over. The story that began with betrayal in a parking garage and a desperate stumble into a pizza shop had ended with wedding vows and a future full of possibility. It wasn't the ending Chris would have chosen 3 years ago, but it was infinitely better than anything he could have imagined. As they drove into the Montana night, Susan reached for his hand. Chris took it, feeling the simple rightness of the gesture. No more running, no more hiding, no more fear, just forward together forever.